Welcome back, legends. You're at Eclipse Wizardry. Another incredible story awaits. What if Narcissa Malfoy found Harry in cupboard at Privet Drive age 6 and ancient black family magic declared him true heir? Subscribe and hit the bell. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1, The Cupboard and the Claim. The letter had been Lucius's idea, which meant Narcissa was the one sitting in the back of a ministry-registered car on the outskirts of Surrey at 2:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, watching rain streak down the window like the sky itself was trying to warn her off. The errand was simple enough, as Lucius's simple errands always were, which is to say it wasn't simple at all, merely made to sound that way when he explained it over breakfast. A contact. A muggle-born ministry clerk named Perkins who had, apparently, been collecting certain documents about Azkaban prisoner transfer records on Lucius's behalf, documents that couldn't be moved through normal wizarding channels without attracting attention. The clerk lived in Surrey. The car was untraceable. Narcissa was, in Lucius's words, above suspicion. She hadn't pointed out that being above suspicion and being trusted were not the same thing. She had simply accepted the address on the folded card he slid across the breakfast table, finished her tea, and made arrangements. The car smelled of leather and damp. Dobby had pressed an umbrella into her hands before she left the manor, his enormous eyes wet with what she'd long since learned to recognize as preemptive apology. She hadn't asked what he was apologizing for. She rarely did. Privet Drive was exactly the kind of street that Narcissa found faintly suffocating, orderly to the point of aggression, every lawn trimmed to the same precise length, every net curtain hanging at the same precise angle, every house painted in variations of the same three inoffensive colors. The kind of street where people watched from behind those curtains and catalogued their neighbors' minor deviations from acceptability. In that respect, she supposed, it was not entirely unlike Malfoy Manor's social orbit. Just considerably less interesting. Perkins lived at number 11. She had the driver stop 2 houses early, because she preferred to walk the last of any distance on foot. It gave her time to settle her expression into something appropriate for the occasion. She was halfway past number 4 when she heard it. It was very faint. Barely anything at all, really, a small sound, muffled, the kind of sound that most people would have attributed to a pipe or a settling floorboard or a neighbor's television. But Narcissa had raised a child. She knew the sound of a child trying not to cry. She stopped. The rain was still coming down in gray, indifferent sheets. The front garden of number 4 was perfectly maintained, its rose bushes pruned with vindictive precision, its path swept clean. Nothing about the house was unusual in any way that the average observer would notice. Narcissa was not an average observer. She stood on the pavement and looked at the house for a long moment, the umbrella Dobby had given her angled against the wind. The sound had stopped. Maybe she'd imagined it. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it was a cat, maybe it was any number of things that were none of her business and would allow her to continue down the street and complete Lucius's tedious errand and be back at the manor by 7. She was already opening the front gate. Later, she would not be able to explain this satisfactorily to anyone, including herself. The closest she could come was this, that she had spent 20 years making decisions based on what was correct, and for one uncharacteristic moment she had made a decision based on what was simply, undeniably true. The sound was a child. The child was in distress. That was the whole of the calculus. The gate opened without a sound. She walked up the path and crouched beside the low wooden door set into the side of the house, the door to a cupboard under the stairs, she realized, barely 2 feet high, and pressed her ear to the painted wood. Silence. Then the smallest, most careful intake of breath she had ever heard. The breath of someone who had learned that making sounds had consequences. "Hello," she said quietly. She kept her voice very level and very calm, the way she spoke to frightened horses. "I can hear you in there. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to make sure you're all right." A long pause. "I'm fine." The voice was small and hoarse and absolutely not fine. It was also, without question, a child's voice, young, maybe 5 or 6, the consonants still slightly rounded. You should go away. I'll consider it, Narcissa said. Can you open the door from inside? Another pause. There's a lock. She looked. There was, in fact, a bolt on the outside of the cupboard door. A bolt. On the outside. She stared at it for a moment and felt something cold and precise move through her. There's a bolt on the outside, she said, keeping her voice even. But the bolt is on my side. I can open it. You shouldn't. The voice had shifted slightly, gone careful and wary in a way no 6-year-old's voice should know how to do. They won't like it. You'll get in trouble. I'm very difficult to get into trouble, Narcissa said, and drew back the bolt. The door swung open, and what was inside it hit her like a physical blow, not the smell, though that was bad enough, old wool and damp and something medicinal, but the sight of the child himself, curled against the back wall of a space barely large enough to contain him, his knees drawn up to his chest, his overlarge clothes hanging off a frame that was simply too small, too thin, the arms wrapped around the knees bearing the kind of scrapes and old bruises that told a very particular story. He had dark hair that stuck up in every direction and the most extraordinary eyes, green, the color of deep water, or new leaves, or something else she couldn't quite name. They were too large for his face, which was the face of a boy who had been given insufficient food for sufficient time. They were also, she noticed, not afraid of her. Wary. Watchful. But not afraid, which told her he'd been afraid of worse things than an unknown woman crouching at his cupboard door and had learned to file them appropriately. Hello, she said again. Hello, said the boy. What's your name? The briefest hesitation. Harry. Harry what? Another hesitation, slightly longer. Potter. Narcissa heard the name, of course. She processed it, of course. She had spent the last 5 years in a world that said the name Potter the way people said the plague or the war, with the weight of enormous things. But what she was looking at was a child in a cupboard with bruised arms and careful eyes who had just told a stranger his name with the wary courage of someone who had learned that the truth got you further than lies even when the truth was dangerous. She said, How long have you been in there, Harry? Since yesterday morning. Not accusatory. Simply informational, as though reporting on the weather. Are you hungry? He looked at her steadily. Mostly, he said. She reached into her bag. It was a handbag, small, charmed like all her bags to hold considerably more than it appeared, and she moved past the folded documents she'd brought for Perkins and past the standard healing kit she had carried since Draco learned to walk, and found a small wrapped package of shortbread biscuits that she'd meant to eat in the car. She held it out. He looked at it for one long moment with an expression that was painful to witness, the expression of someone who has been offered something good enough times with strings attached that the offering itself has become a kind of warning, and then he took it, carefully, and ate with the focused attention of someone who understood that food was not guaranteed. Are you a neighbor? He asked, between biscuits. No. I was passing. Are you going to tell my aunt? What would I tell her? That he stopped, recalibrated. That I talked to you. No, Narcissa said. I'm not going to tell your aunt anything. Can I? She paused, which was not something she did often. May I come inside? Just to have a proper look at you. I want to make sure you haven't been hurt. He considered this with the gravity of a diplomat. Then he shifted sideways, making room that barely existed. She folded herself through the cupboard door with rather more grace than the space deserved, tucking her coat around her and letting her eyes adjust. Up close the picture was worse. There was a cot mattress on the floor, so thin it was barely distinguishable from the floor itself, and a single thin blanket. There were drawings on the inside of the cupboard wall, small and precise, done in pencil, and they showed, she looked more carefully, a world that bore no relationship to a cupboard in Surrey. Mountains. Vast skies. Creatures she didn't quite recognize. A boy on a broomstick, very high up, very free. You drew these, she said. When I'm bored. He watched her look at them. I'm usually bored. They're very good. My aunt says they're rubbish. Narcissa looked at the drawings again. Then she looked at the boy. Your aunt, she said carefully, is wrong. Something shifted in his face at that. Just slightly. The wariness easing a fraction, the way the tide will pull back and show a different surface for a moment before it comes in again. How old are you? She asked. 6. Last month. He paused. I didn't get a cake. Did you tell them it was your birthday? They know. He said it without heat. Just fact. They just don't, they don't really, they're not really, he stopped himself, seemed to be looking for the right word. They don't really want me here, he said finally, with the particular dignity of a child who has arrived at an honest conclusion and decided it's better than a comfortable lie. Narcissa looked at him. He looked back. She had meant to check that he was physically unharmed and then, if the situation warranted it, she had intended to do something sensible and appropriate, contact someone, make a report, take some action that kept her hands clean and her name out of anything messy. She had a plan. The plan was practical. Then she reached out and put her hand over his to check the temperature of his fingers, because his hands looked cold, and the Black family magic woke up. It didn't announce itself gently. It was not the polite chime of a ward activated or the smooth hum of a recognized magical signature. It was a crack, silent but physical, a vibration that started somewhere below her ribs and moved outward through every nerve in her body, and then a sound, deep and resonant, like the lowest note of an organ played in a vaulted stone room, and it went on, building, and the air in the cupboard, which had been stale and cold, suddenly smelled of old parchment and wood smoke and candle wax, the smell of the library at Grimmauld Place, the smell of the Black family tapestry room where she'd done her homework as a girl. Harry went perfectly still. The magic settled around him like a second skin. Narcissa could see it, which was the most unnerving part. She'd never been able to see the family magic before, only feel it, but now there were faint threads of silver running through the air around the boy, converging on him, drawn to him the way iron filings are drawn to a magnet, and the resonance in the room said something she had no words for except that the word for it was recognition. What was that? Harry said. His voice was steady. She would think about that later, how steady his voice was. That, Narcissa said, and she heard the slight unevenness in her own voice and worked to correct it, is very old magic. The oldest magic I know of, in my family. Your family? My family name is Black. She paused. Or was, before I married. She paused again, because there was no way to say the next part simply, but she had always been better at directness than people tended to assume. Harry, what was your father's mother's name? Your grandmother, on your father's side. Do you know it? He frowned, and she could see him going through what he knew, which was apparently not much. I don't, they don't talk about my parents. I'm not, he stopped, and for the first time since she'd opened the door, she caught something that might have been real distress under the careful composure. I don't know their names. I know they died. I know my dad was called James. They say he was, the distress sharpened and he pushed it back. They don't tell me nice things about him. I imagine not, Narcissa said, and kept her voice very gentle, because the Dursleys were the least of what she was now thinking about but they were the most immediate. Your father's mother was called Doria Black, Harry. Before she married your grandfather, she was Doria Black, of this family. Which makes you, she stopped. The silver threads were still there, still moving, wrapping themselves around the boy's small hands, climbing his arms, and she knew with the absolute bone certainty of someone who had grown up in a family whose magic had its own will and its own voice that what she was witnessing was not a warm greeting. It was a claim. The Black family magic was not recognizing Harry Potter as a relative. It was recognizing him as the heir. The heir. The one to whom the magic of the bloodline would pass in preference to all other claimants, over Bellatrix, over Narcissa herself, over even Sirius, who had been the direct heir before Azkaban swallowed him, and certainly over Draco, who had been Narcissa's quiet and private hope. The magic did not operate on sentiment. It operated on bloodline weight and something more ineffable, resonance, rightness, the thing that made some keys fit locks and others not. This boy, sitting in this cupboard, eating shortbread biscuits and looking at her with those impossible green eyes, was the true heir of the noble and most ancient house of Black. And the magic had just told every Black family protection ward that existed in Britain exactly where he was. "We need to leave," Narcissa said, and even as she said it she was already assessing. Perkins and his documents could wait indefinitely, the wards on the Dursley house would be shattered now or very shortly, the Ministry's trace on underage magic would detect the activation if she used her wand, and Lucius. She thought about Lucius. She thought about what he would say when she arrived home with Harry Potter. She thought about what it would mean, politically and strategically and personally, to bring the boy who lived, the named enemy of the Dark Lord her husband still privately served, into Malfoy Manor. She thought about how Lucius would weigh the Black heir claim against the Dark Lord's interest. She thought about what her interests were, in this equation. She thought about the drawings on the wall. The boy on the broomstick, very high up, very free. "Come with me," she said. Harry looked at her. "Where?" "Somewhere better than this." "My aunt will," "Your aunt," Narcissa said, with a calm precision that had ended arguments in Wisengamot committees and across dinner tables and in rooms where men twice her size had tried to intimidate her, "has locked a 6-year-old child in a cupboard without food for more than a day. Your aunt does not get a vote. A beat." He was looking at her with an expression she was learning, the expression of a child trying to determine whether an adult was offering something real or something that would be taken away. She met his eyes and didn't look away. "Okay," he said. He reached under the mattress and retrieved, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, a small collection of objects, 3 smooth pebbles, a stub of pencil, a creased piece of paper with more drawings on it, and a single small photograph she couldn't see properly in the low light but that he handled with a care entirely disproportionate to its apparent condition. These he tucked into the front pocket of his too large jeans with the same gravity with which a general might collect critical documents before evacuating a camp. He looked around the cupboard once. She thought for a moment that he might hesitate, might look back at the drawings on the wall, might feel the pull of the familiar even when the familiar was awful. He didn't. He looked around once, catalogued it, and turned to the door. "Let's go, then," he said. They were out and down the path in under a minute. Narcissa had her wand at her side, not drawn but immediately accessible, and she was monitoring every ward and detection frequency she could sense while Harry walked beside her with his hands in his pockets and his head up, looking around at the rain-grey street with the focused attention of someone seeing it properly for the first time, or perhaps seeing it for the last time and making sure to note it. "Where are we going?" he asked. "My car is at the end of the street." "You have a car?" "I have a driver." He processed this. "Are you rich?" "By most measures, yes." "Huh." He seemed to be filing this away. Then, without any particular change in tone, "The silver stuff. From before. In the cupboard. Is that magic?" She glanced down at him. "Yes." "I thought magic was real," he said, not triumphant, not excited, just reporting another fact that had been confirmed. "I've done things before. Made things happen. My aunt says it's not real but it is." "Yes," Narcissa said. "It is. Is that going to happen again? The silver stuff?" "Possibly." Was it? He thought for a moment. Was it okay? That it happened? She looked at him again. She thought about what the answer really was, the enormous complexity of what the answer really was, the political cascade, the family implications, the fact that she was about to reorder her entire life around a 6-year-old she'd met 20 minutes ago in a cupboard. She thought about the right way to explain it. Yes, she said. It was very okay. They reached the car. Her driver, a discreet man named Aldous who had worked for her family for 15 years and had developed a practice in curiosity about unusual passengers, opened the door without a word. Harry climbed in and looked around the interior with the same systematic attention he'd given the street, then settled into the far corner of the back seat and looked at Narcissa as she got in beside him. "I don't actually know your name," he said. "Narcissa. Narcissa Malfoy. That's a very long name." "It is. What should I call you?" She considered this, which was not a question she had expected to be considering in this car on this errand on this particular afternoon. "I think," she said, and she was choosing each word with the care she usually reserved for Wisengamot testimony, "that for now, you should call me whatever feels right. We'll work out the formalities later." He thought about this. The car was moving now, pulling away from Privet Drive, the street receding in the rear window, the neat roses and net curtains and quiet suffocating order of it all growing smaller and then disappearing entirely as Aldous turned onto the main road. "Narcissa," Harry said, testing it. "Yes? Where's Malfoy Manor?" "Wiltshire." "Is it far?" "An hour, perhaps, depending on traffic." He nodded. Looked out the window. The rain was still coming down, but faster now, the Surrey suburbs giving way to stretches of green that were somewhat more interesting to look at. He had his photograph out of his pocket, she noticed. He was looking at it now, and she could see it was a small, moving image, two people laughing and waving, a young man with very messy hair and a young woman with dark red hair and the same green eyes that were currently examining the photograph with an expression of complicated love and longing that no 6-year-old should be able to produce. She looked away. She had, she realized, been making a list in her head from the moment the car started moving, a list of things to be done, people to be contacted, preparations to be made, arguments to be won. It was a long list. Lucius's name appeared in it several times, each time in a different context. The goblins of Gringotts appeared twice. Dumbledore's name appeared once and then she crossed it out and wrote it again differently. But underneath all of it, running through the list like a thread pulled tight, was something that was not strategic at all, something that had started the moment she'd heard a small sound through a painted wooden door and made the irrational, impractical, completely unjustifiable decision to open it. She was not going to put him back. She hadn't known it as a decision in that moment. But sitting in this car with the boy who had just been declared by the oldest magic in her bloodline to be the rightful heir of her entire family, sitting with him while he looked at the photograph of two laughing dead people and said nothing and asked for nothing and simply endured, as he had clearly been enduring for years without ever having been offered any alternative, she knew it now. She was not going to put him back. Whatever Lucius said. Whatever the ministry said. Whatever Dumbledore said, and he would say quite a lot, she imagined, since Dumbledore had apparently been aware of Harry's living conditions and had chosen them deliberately, a fact that was currently sitting in her chest like a small, very sharp piece of glass. Whatever anyone said, she was not going to put this child back into a cupboard. She was a black by birth, whatever her name said now. And the family magic had spoken. They were about 20 minutes from the manor when Harry fell asleep. It happened between one moment and the next, the way very young children sleep when they've been pushing exhaustion back for too long, suddenly and absolutely, his head dropping sideways against the seat, his face going slack, and the tension that she hadn't quite registered until it was absent easing out of him entirely. He was, in sleep, simply and purely a small boy, his mouth slightly open, his impossible hair more chaotic than ever, the photograph still loosely held in one hand. Narcissa took out her wand. She cast a warming charm because the car was getting cold and his clothes were frankly inadequate. She cast a very light diagnostic charm, the kind her mother had used when she or Bellatrix or Andy had come home injured and tried to hide it, and read the results with the careful, trained eye of someone who had spent 20 years keeping a household safe through quiet competence. Malnourishment, chronic. Several healed fractures in the ribs, older, 2 to 3 years. Healing lacerations on both palms, recent. Old bruising on both upper arms, consistent with being seized and shaken. General magical suppression, the kind that built up in a magical child kept in a heavily muggle environment with actively negative reinforcement. She sat with these results for a moment. Outside the window, England slid past in greens and greys. Then she put her wand away, composed her face, and began rehearsing what she was going to say to Lucius. The manner announced itself the way it always did, a shift in the air first, a pressure change that had nothing to do with weather, the wards recognizing her and stepping back like a very large, very old dog making way for its owner. The iron gates swung open as the car came up the drive, and then the house itself was there, grey stone and long windows and the aggressive aristocratic beauty of something built to last and to impress. Harry woke when the car stopped. He didn't startle. He simply opened his eyes, looked around with swift, economical attention, saw where he was, and looked at the house through the rain-speckled window with an expression that was entirely still. "Is this it?" he said. "Yes." He looked at it for another moment. "It's very big." "It is." "Do you live here with your family?" "My husband." "My son." "He's your age, I think, 6, or nearly." Something moved in his face. She wasn't sure what it was. "Do you think they'll mind?" he said. "That I'm here?" This was, Narcissa thought, one of the more extraordinary questions she had ever been asked, delivered in the conversational tone of someone who had had a great deal of practice asking it and had learned to ask it very quietly and not expect much. She thought of the diagnostic results. She thought of the bolt on the outside of the cupboard door. "My son is going to have questions," she said honestly. "My husband is going to have objections." Harry looked at her. He was, she thought, very alert for someone who had just woken up. "But that's my problem to manage," she said, "not yours. Your job, for tonight, is to eat something decent and sleep in an actual bed. Everything else we can work out tomorrow." "You're very certain," he said, not accusingly. Just observantly. "I generally am." He seemed to find this acceptable. He looked at the house again, and she watched him make the same calculation she'd watched him make on Privet Drive, the rapid, quiet assessment of what was safe and what was dangerous and how to navigate the available information. He was doing it again now with the manner, with her, with the whole enormous impossible fact of the last 2 hours. "Okay," he said, for the second time that afternoon. She got out of the car. He got out after her, and she offered her hand as they went up the steps, not as direction but as steadiness, and he took it without comment, his small cold hand in hers. The manor doors opened as she reached them. Beyond them the entrance hall was warm and lit with floating lights, the portraits on the walls already stirring and murmuring as they recognized her. And there, at the top of the entrance hall stairs, silver blonde and immaculate and looking down at them with an expression of cold, precise surprise, was Lucius Malfoy. His eyes moved from Narcissa's face to the child beside her. They stayed there for a moment that stretched considerably longer than any moment had a right to. "Narcissa," he said, in the quiet, perfectly controlled voice he used when he was furious and choosing to be surgical about it. "Who, precisely, is that?" She looked up at him. She had been rehearsing this. She had been choosing her words carefully in the car, finding the ones that would cover the situation most efficiently, that would head off the worst of the arguments, that would manage the revelation in the order most likely to produce the outcome she needed. She said, "This is Harry Potter." A beat. "And the family magic," she continued, her voice as even and certain as she had ever made it, "has named him the true heir of the House of Black." The portraits along the staircase went absolutely silent. Outside, the rain hammered the windows. The floating lights swayed very slightly, as though the manor itself was holding its breath. Harry looked up at the silver-blonde man at the top of the stairs with those green eyes, completely and utterly unafraid. Lucius Malfoy looked back. "We need to talk," Lucius said. "Yes," Narcissa agreed. "We do. And she walked into her house with the true heir of the House of Black beside her, and the door closed behind them, and the portraits on the walls slowly began to whisper to one another in voices that grew, as the evening deepened, more and more certain, more and more sure. Chapter 2. The boy in the manor. The guest room Narcissa chose was on the third floor, east wing, far enough from Lucius's study that the argument she was about to have wouldn't carry through the walls to wherever Harry was sleeping, but close enough to the main staircase that she could hear if anything happened in the night. She had Dobby prepare it while she stood in the entrance hall managing Lucius's expression, which was doing a number of things simultaneously and none of them were good. Harry stood beside her through all of it with his hands in his pockets and said nothing, which she was already beginning to understand was his default mode in unfamiliar environments: become invisible, collect information, decide later. It was a survival instinct so thoroughly ingrained it had become personality, and it made her chest hurt in the specific way things did when they were both true and terrible. Lucius had not come down the stairs. He stood at the top of them and looked, and his looking was the kind that catalogued and filed, and then he said, "Draco is in the drawing room," in the tone of someone reminding an opponent of a piece they'd apparently forgotten was on the board. "Then someone should feed Harry before they put him to bed," Narcissa said, "and it won't be Draco." A silence. Then Lucius turned and walked away, which was not agreement but was also not immediate war, and Narcissa translated this accurately as we speak in private, later, and took Harry toward the kitchen. He ate. That was perhaps the simplest thing that happened in Malfoy Manor that evening and certainly the most uncomplicated. Mipsy, the kitchen elf, put a bowl of soup in front of him and a plate of bread and butter and a glass of warm milk with honey, the kind of meal that was nothing elaborate but was hot and real, and Harry ate it with the same focused, quiet efficiency with which he'd eaten the shortbread biscuits in the car, not rushing, not performing gratitude, simply eating as though the act itself required his full attention and deserved it. Narcissa sat across from him and drank her tea and let him eat. "Thank you," he said, when the bowl was empty. He said it to Mipsy, who was hovering near the stove, and Mipsy blinked her great lamp-like eyes and went slightly pink around the ears in the way that house elves did when they were surprised by consideration. "Harry Potter is very welcome," she said, in a small, wondering voice. He looked at her properly. "Do you have a name?" "Mipsy, sir." "Thank you, Mipsy." Narcissa watched Mipsy go back to the stove looking as though she'd been handed something rare and valuable. She thought about a boy in a cupboard drawing mountains on the walls, and she thought about the way he'd already learned to see the people others didn't bother to see, and she thought that the Black family magic might have known something she hadn't even begun to understand yet. Dobby appeared to show him to the room, and Harry followed without complaint, pausing at the kitchen door to look back at Narcissa. "Will you be okay?" he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "With your husband." He was entirely matter-of-fact. He didn't look happy. "Will you be okay?" She looked at him for a moment, this small, thin, exhausted child who had just had the most disorienting afternoon of what had apparently been a thoroughly disorienting life, and whose first concern on leaving the room was whether she was going to be all right. "Yes," she said. "I'll be fine." He held her gaze for a moment with those green eyes, doing the assessment thing. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and followed Dobby up the stairs. Narcissa finished her tea. Then she went to find Lucius. He was in his study, which meant he'd had time to compose himself, which meant the conversation was going to be controlled and cold rather than immediately explosive. She had opinions about which was worse. She closed the study door behind her and stood in front of it while he sat behind the great mahogany desk and looked at her with eyes the color of winter light. "Tell me," he said, "that what you said in the entrance hall was some variety of performance." "You know I don't perform for entrances," she said. "That's your preference, not mine." "Narcissa, the magic activated when I touched his hand." "In the cupboard." A pause. "What cupboard?" "The one they'd locked him in. At the Dursley house." She watched his face and said, before he could redirect, "He's 6 years old, Lucius." He has 3 healed rib fractures and he hasn't eaten since yesterday morning, and they put him in a cupboard with a bolt on the outside of the door. The Dursleys' treatment of the boy is not, don't. She said it quietly, but it cut through the room like a blade. Don't tell me their treatment of the boy is not our concern. He is the Black Heir. He is our concern now, whether you find it convenient or not. Lucius was quiet for a moment. She had married him at 17, and in the years since she had learned his silences the way sailors learn the sea, by the particular quality of the quiet, by what was moving underneath it. This silence was the one where he was recalculating, adjusting from one set of assumptions to another, and she waited because interrupting that process was never productive. The Black Heir claim, he said finally. You're certain? I saw it, Lucius. The silver, you know what the activation looks like. I've only ever seen it in texts before. It wasn't a passive recognition. It was a full Heir declaration. Another silence, longer, and she could see him moving the pieces. Lucius was many things, several of them genuinely terrible, but he was not stupid, and the thing about not being stupid was that it occasionally produced the right answer for entirely the wrong reasons. If the claim is real, he said slowly, then a formal confirmation at Gringotts would make it legally unassailable. The boy would hold the black title and estate. Everything held in trust since Sirius. He stopped. Yes, Narcissa said. The Dark Lord, Lucius said, very carefully, had explicit interests in the Potter boy. The Dark Lord, Narcissa said, with equal care, is currently a rumor and a face in the back of someone else's head. The Black Heir claim is current, legal, and precedent protected under magical law that predates the ministry itself. If you're doing the calculation, Lucius, do it properly. She watched him do it. She watched the moment when the calculation produced an answer he hadn't expected, and then the moment when he began to see the shape of something he might be able to use, and she felt the familiar mixture of relief and weariness that came with knowing how to move him, knowing that the only reliable way to move him was to put the right numbers in front of him and let him do the maths himself. He stays, Lucius said. Not permission. Declaration. He had, she noticed, already reframed it as his own decision, which was fine. He could have the framing. She had the outcome. He stays, she agreed. Draco doesn't know who he is yet. Draco will find out by morning regardless. You know he will. The portraits will have talked. Lucius's mouth thinned. Of course they will. He stood, moved to the window, looked out at the dark Wiltshire grounds. The ministry will want to know within a week. Dumbledore put him in that cupboard. She said it flat and without heat because heat would let him dismiss it. Flat was harder to dismiss. Knowingly. There are protections on that house, blood wards, Lucius, keyed to Lily Potter's sacrifice. Dumbledore constructed those wards. He knew what he was placing Harry into. Lucius turned from the window and looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw past the cold calculation to something more complicated underneath it. He was a man who loved his son with a ferocity he'd never learned to show in any way except control, and something about the image she'd handed him, even filtered through politics and maths, had landed. Get the boy healthy, he said. Then we go to Gringotts. He picked up a document from his desk and looked at it. The conversation, in his assessment, was over. Narcissa said, Lucius. He looked up. Thank you, she said. She meant it precisely and he knew she meant it precisely, and it cost neither of them anything to acknowledge it. She went to bed. She lay awake for an hour, staring at the ceiling, listening to the manor settle around her, and thought about a boy on a broomstick, very high up, very free. Harry was up before the sun. Narcissa knew because Dobby, who was constitutionally incapable of not reporting things he thought she should know, appeared at the foot of her bed at 5:30 with enormous eyes and the information that the small master had been awake since 4 and was currently sitting on the window seat in his room looking at the grounds. She found him there, knees drawn up, chin on one hand, looking out at the grey pre-dawn landscape of the manor grounds with the same systematic attention he brought to everything. He had found, somewhere, a piece of paper and the stub of pencil from his pocket, and there was a drawing taking shape on the paper, the grounds as seen from the window, the hedge maze in the distance, the ornamental lake catching the first grey light. "You should be sleeping," she said. "I woke up," he said, without looking away from the window. "I do that." She sat in the armchair near the window and didn't push it. After a moment he looked at her. "There are peacocks," he said. "Yes. My husband's." He thought about this. "Why?" "Aesthetics, primarily." He looked back at the peacocks, which were doing what they always did in early morning, standing on the lawn looking decorative and slightly offended by the weather. "They look angry," he said. "They frequently are. Like your husband." She looked at him. He looked back, completely guileless, just reporting an observation. "My husband," she said, choosing her words, "is going to take some adjusting to. For you and for him. Is he going to try to put me back?" "No." She said it without hesitation, which was the only way to say things to a child who had learned to hear the doubt in hesitation. "He is not." Harry looked at the peacocks again. Then he held up the drawing, not for approval, just for her to see. She looked at it. The hedge maze was remarkably accurate for a pencil sketch done in half-light. The lake was better than accurate. He'd caught the quality of the water, the way it held light, in about 12 economical lines. "Mipsy could probably get you proper drawing things," she said. "I don't want to ask for too much." "Harry." She waited until he looked at her. "You're allowed to ask for things." He considered this with the gravity of someone receiving a rule they'd never encountered before and were deciding whether to trust. Then he went back to the drawing. Draco found him at breakfast. Or more precisely, Draco came into the breakfast room at 7 in the manner of a small blonde tornado, still in his dressing gown, hair uncharacteristically disordered, wearing the expression of a child who had been awake for some time thinking very hard about something and had arrived at the conclusion that the only resolution was to confront it directly, and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of Harry sitting at the breakfast table with a bowl of porridge, reading what appeared to be a book about magical creatures that Narcissa had found on the shelf in the guest room. They looked at each other. Harry looked up from the book with the steady, calibrated attention of someone who had learned to take the measure of people quickly. Draco stood in the doorway with an expression that moved rapidly through surprise, suspicion, and a kind of fascinated calculation before settling on something that looked, almost against its will, like curiosity. "You're the boy from last night," Draco said. "Yes," Harry said. "Mother brought you." "Yes." "Why?" Harry looked at him. "Magic stuff," he said. Draco came fully into the room, pulled out a chair across the table from Harry, and sat down with the practiced authority of a child who had been sat at this table his entire life. He poured himself orange juice and looked at Harry over the glass. "What's your name?" "Harry." "I'm Draco." "I know. Your mother told me." Draco absorbed this. He was studying Harry the way Harry had studied the peacocks, systematically, taking inventory. Narcissa, in the doorway, had decided not to announce herself for a moment, because the thing happening at the breakfast table was happening better without her in it. "The portraits were all talking last night," Draco said. "About a Heir declaration." "Your mother told me about that," Harry said. "The silver stuff in the cupboard." "You were in a cupboard?" "Yes." "Why?" Harry shrugged. "The people I lived with put me there." Draco frowned. The frown was genuine, and Narcissa noted it, the thing that happened to Draco's face when he encountered something that his carefully constructed understanding of the world couldn't immediately process. He had been raised with very exact ideas about how things were ordered, about who mattered and who didn't, about what was acceptable and what was beneath consideration. A child in a cupboard was not, apparently, sitting neatly in any of those categories. "That's wrong," Draco said, and he said it with the simple, unthinking certainty of a 6-year-old who hasn't yet learned to negotiate what's wrong in the service of what's convenient. Harry looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said. "It is." A pause. Draco drank his orange juice. "Can you do magic?" Draco asked. "I don't know how. Things just happen sometimes." "Like what?" Harry seemed to be deciding how much to share, and then to decide, with a slight internal shrug she could read from the door, to just say it. "Once when my cousin was chasing me I ended up on the school roof. I don't know how. And once when my aunt cut my hair very short it grew back overnight." Draco stared at him. Then, in spite of himself, he started to laugh, a genuine 6-year-old laugh, startled out of him, clearly not the response he'd intended to have to anything this morning. "On the roof?" "She was very angry about the roof," Harry agreed, and there was the smallest hint of something in his voice, dry, the barest trace of humor, the way you talked about things that had been terrible when enough time had passed to let you see the edges of them. Draco was still grinning. "I've wanted to get on the roof before. Father won't let me." "You have magic. You could probably do it." "I don't have it yet. Not properly. Mother says it starts coming when you're 7 sometimes, 8 mostly." Harry looked thoughtful. "Mine started earlier, I think. But I didn't know what it was." Narcissa came into the room then, and both of them looked up, and the conversation sealed itself off the way children's conversations did when adults arrived, not hostilely, just adjusted, filed away. She sat at the head of the table and accepted the tea Dobby produced and looked at the two of them across the breakfast things, her son and the boy she'd brought home from Surrey, both dark-haired, both 6, both studying each other with the careful attention of people deciding something important. Lucius appeared in the doorway, took in the tableau, and sat down at the other end of the table without saying anything. The silence should have been uncomfortable. Somehow it wasn't quite. "Harry drew the grounds this morning," Narcissa said, "to nobody in particular." Draco looked at Harry. "Can I see?" Harry pulled the folded piece of paper from his pocket and slid it across the table. Draco unfolded it, looked at it, and his eyebrows went up. "You drew this? Today? From the window? Before it got light?" Draco looked at the drawing for a long moment, then looked at Harry, then looked at Lucius at the other end of the table. Something moved in Draco's face, something that was reading the room and the situation and the presence of his father in it and was deciding, very consciously, for a 6-year-old, what to say. "It's good," he said. He said it loudly, deliberately, addressing it to the general air of the room, which included his father. "Really good." Lucius looked at the drawing that Draco held up. He said nothing. But he looked. The days that followed were, in their way, stranger than the night of the arrival, because strangeness is most disorienting not in the dramatic moments but in the ordinary ones. Narcissa had expected the drama, Lucius's cold management of the situation, the need to set wards and contact the right people and manage the information carefully, and she was equipped for drama. What she hadn't quite expected was the texture of ordinary life with Harry in it, and how much that texture would reveal. He was very quiet. Not the withdrawn silence of trauma, not exactly, though that was in there too, but a genuine, considered quietness, the quietness of someone who had learned to be present without demanding space and had discovered, somewhere in there, that he actually didn't mind it. He watched. He listened. He read anything that was put in front of him with an attention that Narcissa found remarkable, given that the Dursleys had apparently done nothing to encourage it and everything to suppress it. Draco, who had been raised as a solitary child and who had spent 6 years being the most important person in every room he occupied, had never had to navigate the presence of another child who was his approximate age and equal in rank. He handled this with mixed success. There were moments of unexpected generosity, Draco pointing out the hidden passages in the manor, Draco explaining the family portraits with proprietary enthusiasm, Draco producing his collection of chocolate frog cards with the casual largesse of a child who has plenty and wants the other one to know it, and also, buried underneath the wanting to know it, actually wanting to share. There were also moments of reflexive competition, the instinct to be first and best and most significant, and on these occasions Harry simply waited him out, and the waiting was so patient and so undramatic that Draco kept being wrong-footed by it. On the fourth day, Draco attempted to explain magical theory to Harry in a way that was not quite condescending but was moving in that direction. Harry listened to the whole explanation. Then he said, "That makes sense. Can I try something?" He reached out and held his hand over Draco's chocolate frog card collection on the table between them, about 30 cards, arranged in order, and the silver came. It was quiet and small, nothing like the eruption in the cupboard, just a shimmer at the edges of his fingers, and every card lifted half an inch off the table and sorted itself into a different order, an order that Narcissa, watching from her chair by the fire, realized was alphabetical by wizard name. Draco stared at the cards. Then at Harry. "How did you do that?" "I just sort of thought at it." "You're not supposed to be able to do that. You haven't had training." "I know." Draco stopped. The competitive instinct and the genuine fascination were fighting each other openly on his face, and then something happened that she thought might be the most significant thing that had happened in the manor since Harry arrived. Draco let the fascination win. He leaned forward, chin on his hands, and said, "Do it again." Harry did it again. He sorted the cards differently this time, by century, which meant he'd read enough of them in the last 30 seconds to know when each wizard had lived, and the silver threads did their quiet work while both of them watched. Lucius appeared in the doorway of the sitting room at the end of this performance and watched, and his face did something complicated that Narcissa couldn't fully read, which was unusual, and she filed it. She went to Gringotts on the 6th day. Not with Harry, that would come later, formally, once the legal arrangements were in order. She went alone, through the entrance she used for the Malfoy family accounts, with a sealed letter of notification and the documented account of the Heir declaration. The goblin she met with was named Sharpclaw, and he read the letter in full and the documentation in full and then looked up at her with eyes like black beetles. "The claim is consistent with our records," he said. The Potter-Black bloodline convergence was noted at the time of Doria Black's marriage. It was considered a dormant line at the time of the last heir assessment. A pause. "The dormancy has clearly ended. I need the confirmation formalized," Narcissa said. "Legally binding, registered with the Wiesengemot, and publicly recorded. The formal confirmation requires the presence of the heir." "I'm aware. I'm initiating the process today. The heir will attend for the confirmation ceremony at your earliest convenience." Another pause. The goblin looked at her with the expression of someone who found her slightly interesting, which in Narcissa's experience was about as warm as goblins tended to get. "The heir declaration will carry significantly broader implications than a standard inheritance confirmation, Mrs. Malfoy," he said. "The Black estate has been in contested suspension since the imprisonment of Sirius Black. A formal heir declaration would resolve all contested claims and transfer active control of the estate, the properties, and the family magics to the declared heir. It would also," he looked at her, "require the Black family seat on the Wiesengemot to be reassigned." "I know," Narcissa said. "The ministry will object." "Let them." The goblin's mouth did something that might, in the right light, have been the beginning of a smile. "We will have the documentation prepared. Bring the heir in a week's time." She was back at the manor by noon. In the afternoon she found Harry and Draco in the library, Harry reading something significantly above his age level with the slightly furrowed concentration of someone working at the edge of their comprehension and finding it interesting rather than defeating, and Draco reading the same book over his shoulder and occasionally offering interpretations that were sometimes helpful and sometimes completely wrong. "There's a library at your parents' old house," she said to Harry, when there was a natural pause. "In London. Grimmauld Place. It was your great-aunt's house, well, your grandmother's sister. It belongs to the Black estate, which means it belongs to you now. It has." She thought about the library at Grimmauld Place. its darkness and its depths and the sheer hostile vastness of its collection, a great many books. Harry looked up. More than this library? Different books. Older. Something kindled in his face. Can we go? Not yet. Soon. She sat down in the armchair and looked at him. Harry, I need to tell you some things. About who you are and what's going to happen. I'd like Draco to stay, if you're both all right with that, because most of what I'm going to say is going to affect both of you. They settled, both of them, with the attentiveness of children who could sense weight in a conversation and adjusted accordingly. Draco pulled his knees up on the window seat. Harry closed the book, keeping his finger in the page. She told him about his parents. Not the ministry version, not Dumbledore's version, but the facts she knew herself, that James Potter had been brilliant and reckless and funny and that Lily Evans Potter had been one of the most talented witches of her generation, that they had both died in a war that had taken a great many people, that Harry had survived it in a way no one had been able to fully explain, and that because of that survival, the wizarding world had been calling him the boy who lived for 5 years as though the name was more important than the person. Harry listened to all of it without moving. When she finished there was a silence. Dumbledore put me with the Dursleys on purpose, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Why? The blood wards. Protection magic keyed to your mother's sacrifice. The theory is that staying with her blood family maintained the protections. She paused. It's not an unsound theory. But he knew what it was like. She held his gaze. I believe he made a calculation, she said. I think he decided that the protection was worth the cost. I disagree with that calculation. Harry looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the window, and something in his face did the shuddering thing, the going inward thing, and she let it happen because pushing at it would only bury it deeper. I'm not going back, he said. Not to her, to himself, she thought. Setting it down as a fact. No, she said. You're not. Draco had been very quiet throughout this. He spoke now, abruptly, in the tone of someone who had been sitting on something for several minutes and had decided to say it regardless of consequence. Father knew about you. Before you came here. People talk about you, the boy who lived, and he'd always, he stopped. He was on the other side. In the war. Harry looked at him. I know, he said. Your mother told me. Draco looked at his own hands. Does that, he stopped again, and then pushed through it, does that change things? For you. Harry looked at him for a moment. The look was direct and honest and contained none of the performance of diplomacy. Your mum found me in a cupboard and brought me home, he said. You showed me the hidden passages and you shared your frog cards. A pause. The war was before we were born. Draco looked at him. Something shifted in his face, relief, and something else, something that in an older person would have been the look of someone getting a second chance they hadn't quite believed in. Okay, he said, in an echo of the word Harry himself kept using, and somehow in both their mouths it meant the same thing, not a casual agreement, but something more considered. An actual decision. Lucius found Narcissa in the garden that evening, walking the long gravel path beside the roses. She heard him before she saw him, the deliberate crunch of his footsteps, the pace that meant he had something to say and had chosen to say it outside the walls of the house, away from the portraits. He walked beside her for a moment without speaking. I've been thinking about Dumbledore, he said. So have I. If the heir claim goes to Gringotts, when it does, Dumbledore will know within a day. He has contacts among the goblins. He paused. He'll come to the house. Let him. Lucius looked sideways at her. You're quite certain. The magic is the magic, Lucius. He can't unmake a heir declaration. He can express concern. He can invoke the blood wards and the boy's protection and whatever other arguments he has ready. But he can't touch the claim. He could make the case that the boy should be returned to the Dursleys. The Blood Wards were maintaining protection against a Dark Lord who is currently without a body, Narcissa said. Against that, we balance the documented physical condition of a child who has been kept in a cupboard and fed intermittently for 5 years. If Dumbledore wants to make that argument before the Wisengamot, I would deeply enjoy watching him try. Another silence. The roses were dark in the evening light. The boy sorted Draco's cards, Lucius said. I know. I saw. He's 6. Yes. A pause that was different from the others, not calculating, not managing. What is he, Narcissa, he said, and for once the question sounded genuine rather than strategic. She thought about the silver threads in the cupboard. The resonance she'd felt, the deep organ note, the absolute certainty of the oldest magic she knew saying this is the one. She thought about the drawings on the cupboard wall, the boy so high up on his broomstick, so entirely free. I don't know yet, she said honestly. But I think we're going to find out. They walked back toward the house together. In the library window, she could see the faint movement of 2 heads bent over a book, dark hair and blonde, close together in the warm light. Chapter 3, Gold and Blood. The morning they went to Gringotts, Harry woke up before everyone else again and went to the kitchen and made tea. He'd watched Mipsy do it 3 times and he was precise about it. Kettle, loose leaf, 2 minutes not 3, a small ceramic jug for the milk. When Narcissa came downstairs at 6 she found him sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups and a book about goblin banking history that he'd pulled from the library's lower shelf, and he pushed 1 cup toward her without looking up from the page. She sat down. Drank her tea. Outside the kitchen window the Wiltshire dawn was doing something extraordinary with the light over the grounds, all silver and amber, and the peacocks were standing in it looking like they knew it and were furious about people seeing them look good. Anything useful? She asked, nodding at the book. Goblins are older than wizards, he said. Or at least they say they are and they've never been successfully contradicted. He turned a page. They've had the same banking system for about 900 years and they've fought 14 wars to protect it. That's, he looked up, quite a lot of wars. It is. Do they fight with Gringotts specifically or with wizards in general? Both, historically. At the moment there's a working arrangement. She paused. Don't let them know you've been reading about the wars. Goblins find it either respectful or threatening depending on their mood and there's no reliable way to predict which. Harry absorbed this. What should I do when we're there? Be yourself. He looked at her steadily. I've been told my whole life that being myself is a problem. She held his gaze. I'm aware that you've been told that. I'm telling you the opposite. Being yourself today is going to be more important than being polished or strategic or careful. The goblins will read all of those things and they'll read through them, and they will respect genuine overperformed every single time. He went back to the book for a moment, turned another page, and she could see him deciding to trust this. Not blindly. He never did anything blindly. But deciding it was worth trying. Will it hurt? He said. The confirmation thing. There's a blood element. A small cut on the palm. The blood goes on the family stone, it's a piece of obsidian that's been in the Black Vault for centuries. It's not painful for long. She paused. You've had worse. Something crossed his face, very briefly. Yeah, he said. I have. Draco appeared at 6:20, still in his pajamas, to announce that he was coming. Narcissa said, You're not. But, you're 6 years old and it's a legal proceeding. You'll come next time. Go back to bed. Draco looked at Harry with the expression of someone looking for an ally. Harry, who was very diplomatically still reading, did not provide one. Draco went back upstairs with the stiff dignity of a person who intends to remember this slight. Lucius came down at 7, already dressed with the immaculate precision that Narcissa had watched him develop over 20 years into something that was less about fashion and more about armor. He looked at Harry for a moment, taking in the tea and the book and the quiet self-possession, and then looked at Narcissa. "I'll be taking the Fleur directly," he said. "I have a meeting with Selwyn before the Gringotts' appointment." He picked up the Daily Prophet from the table, glanced at the front page, set it down. "Have Aldous bring the car around for 9. I'll meet you at the bank." "Fine," Narcissa said. He left. Harry watched him go and then looked at the space where he'd been. "He manages things," Harry said. "Yes. Like the people at the Dursleys managed things. My uncle, mostly." Narcissa set down her teacup. "Not exactly like that." Harry seemed to be comparing some internal set of measurements. "No," he agreed, after a moment. "Not exactly." He closed the book and stood up. "I should get dressed. I don't have very much though. Dobby laid something out on your bed." He looked at her, and she watched the question move across his face, the same question he'd asked himself about the drawing things, about the milk with honey, about every offered thing, and then watched him decide again that it was worth accepting. "Thank you," he said, and went upstairs. The drive into London was quieter than the drive from Surrey had been. Harry watched the motorway give way to city with the attention he gave everything, but there was something else too, a stillness that Narcissa recognized, because she felt something similar approaching Gringotts, and she had been doing this for 30 years. Something about the bank produced it. The building itself was designed to produce it, the white marble and the vast doors, the reminder that there were things considerably older and considerably less forgiving than the wizarding world's various political fashions. Harry looked up at the building from the pavement and was quiet for a moment. "The inscription," Narcissa said. "On the doors." He read it. She watched his face as he read it, the warning about the thieves who thought to outwit the goblins, and he was quiet again, but differently quiet. Thinking. "Fair," he said. She laughed, which surprised her, and he looked at her with that small careful thing in his eyes that was almost a smile. They went in. The noise of Gringotts was the first thing, the vast shuffling, counting, scratching industry of it, the chandeliers above making everything bright and cold, the goblins at their stations performing the fundamental act of making money behave as though it were serious. Harry walked beside her through it and looked at everything without staring, which was a social skill most adults hadn't mastered, and when the receiving goblin at the main desk looked down at them from its elevated position with the suspicious assessment goblins gave everyone, Harry met its eyes directly. "We have an appointment," Narcissa said. "With Sharpclaw. Narcissa Malfoy, regarding the Black Heir declaration." The goblin looked at Harry. Harry looked back. "The heir," the goblin said. "Yes," Harry said, simply, without fanfare. Something shifted in the goblin's face. It was not warmth, goblins didn't do warmth as a professional posture, but it was something adjacent to attention, the way a musician's ear catches an unexpected note and identifies it as interesting rather than wrong. "This way," it said. Sharpclaw's office was deeper in the bank than any of the offices Narcissa usually visited, down 2 sets of stairs and through a corridor where the stone was so old it had gone smooth and dark and the lamps burned a blue-white that was nothing like candlelight. Harry walked through it with his hands at his sides and his eyes moving over everything and said nothing, which was the right thing to do in Gringotts. Silence was the appropriate register. Lucius was already in the office when they arrived. He was sitting in one of the 2 chairs in front of Sharpclaw's desk with the particular posture of a man who had sat in important offices his entire life and was comfortable. He looked at Harry when they came in and gave a single small nod that could have meant anything. Sharpclaw was behind the desk. He was older than the goblin at the front desk, his face a complex geography of age and experience, his eyes the same black beetle sharpness but deeper. He looked at Narcissa and then looked at Harry with an expression that was explicitly professional and beneath which was something else entirely. "Harry James Potter," he said. Harry stood in front of the desk and said, "Yes. I have reviewed the documentation submitted by Narcissa Malfoy regarding the heir declaration that occurred on the 13th of July. I have also reviewed the Black family bloodline records held in the Gringotts archive, which have not been examined in the matter of succession since 1981. He paused, and Narcissa noticed that he was watching Harry with a precision that went beyond the professional. Before we proceed to formal confirmation, I am required to ask, do you come to this proceeding of your own will and without coercion? Harry looked at Narcissa, and the look was not asking for an answer, it was checking something, the way you checked a compass bearing. He looked back at Sharpclaw. Yes, he said. Do you understand that the declaration, if confirmed, is permanent and legally binding under wizarding law, goblin law, and the ancient compact of blood magic that predates both? I understand what I've been told, Harry said. Which is that my family's magic says I'm the heir and you're going to confirm whether it's right. A pause. I trust the magic. I felt it. Sharpclaw looked at him for a long moment. You felt the declaration. It was like, Harry seemed to be searching for the right description, and not willing to accept an imprecise one. It was like something very old saying there you are. The silence in the room was the particular quality of a silence where several people have all been struck by the same thing and are managing their reactions with varying degrees of success. Lucius, to his credit, was managing his with his usual glacial composure. Narcissa was managing hers by looking at her hands. Sharpclaw placed a black stone on the desk between them. It was perhaps the size of a large book, obsidian, its surface so dark it seemed to absorb the blue-white lamplight rather than reflect it. There were markings on it that were not quite runes, older than runes, the way the corridor outside was older than decor, functional rather than decorative. The heir will place their dominant hand on the stone, Sharpclaw said. He produced a small silver instrument, no larger than a letter opener, with an edge that was clearly designed for a specific and singular purpose. I will take a small amount of blood from the palm. The blood will make contact with the stone. The stone will confirm the declaration or it will not. He looked at Harry. The process takes approximately 30 seconds. It is not entirely painless. Harry looked at the stone. Then he looked at the silver instrument. Then he put his right hand on the stone. He did not look at Narcissa for reassurance. He looked at the stone, and his expression was the expression she was coming to recognize as his baseline, not fear, not performance, just attention. He was here, in this moment, looking at it directly. Sharpclaw made a small precise cut across the center of Harry's palm. The blood that welled up was very red against the black stone, and for the first second it was only that, blood on a dark surface, the small quick breath Harry took, perfectly controlled. Then the stone moved. It didn't move physically. It moved in the way that light moves through water, a ripple through its entire substance, the black surface going briefly luminous with a light that had no color that Narcissa had words for, a light that was simply old, and the markings on the stone's surface ignited one by one in a sequence that was clearly a progression, a recognition, the stone working through something in the way a person works through a proof. Harry's hand didn't move. The light in the markings reached the final symbol and stopped, and then it went back through all of them, all at once, and the room rang with the same low resonant note that Narcissa had heard in the cupboard on Privet Drive, the organ note, the note that meant the Black family magic was speaking at full register rather than in the muttered shorthand it used for ordinary things. The sound went on for 5 full seconds. Then it stopped. Harry lifted his hand from the stone. The cut was already closing. He looked at it, turned his palm over, looked at the closing line of it with scientific interest, flexed his fingers. Sharpclaw was looking at the stone. Then at Harry. Then at the stone again. Well, he said. Which was, Narcissa would reflect later, rather a significant thing for a goblin to say in a professional context. Confirmed, she said. Confirmed. He lifted his eyes from the stone. But I need you to understand something, Mrs. Malfoy, Mr. Malfoy. What the stone showed us was not a standard heir confirmation. He folded his hands on the desk. Standard confirmations activate between 4 and 7 symbols. There are 16 symbols on the Black family stone. The declaration activated all 16. A silence. What does that mean? Harry asked. Sharpclaw looked at him directly, and the look carried more weight than any look from a goblin that Narcissa had witnessed. It means that you are not simply the Black family heir by bloodline inheritance. You hold the full ancestral weight of the family magic, not a portion of it, all of it, including the portions that have been dormant since the 17th century. A pause. In our records, we have documented full 16 symbol activations on 3 occasions in the history of the Black family. The first was Phineas Nigellus Black in 1839. The second was Arcturus Black II in 1901. The third is you. What were they like? Harry said. The other two. The corner of Sharpclaw's mouth did the thing that Narcissa had tentatively identified as almost smiling. Formidable, he said. And considerably less calm at age 6 than you are currently being. Harry looked at the stone. Can I keep it? The cut, I mean, it's interesting, the way it's healing. He looked up and correctly read the room. Never mind. Lucius said, from his chair, with the tone of a man who has been recalculating throughout the entire proceeding and has arrived somewhere he didn't expect, the Wisengamot seat. Will be formally reassigned within the week, Sharpclaw said. The public record will be updated. The Black estate properties, including Grimald Place, Black Manor in Scotland, the property in France, and the associated vaults, will transfer to the heir's account with a designated guardian administrator until he comes of age. He looked at Narcissa. I assume you will serve as guardian administrator. Yes, she said. Then I will need your signature on the administration documents. He produced a scroll that was considerably longer than Narcissa had expected. He looked at Harry. And yours, as a formality, though the heir declaration itself is the operative document. We have magically assisted signatories for heirs under the age of consent. Harry looked at the scroll. I can sign my own name, he said. Sharpclaw produced a quill that was clearly intended for an adult hand. Harry took it, adjusted his grip with the pragmatic adaptability of someone who had learned to make things work rather than wait for the right conditions, and signed his name in a hand that was small but absolutely clear. Harry James Potter. The room seemed to exhale. They were back in the Gringotts entrance hall 20 minutes later, documentation sealed and filed, and Narcissa was aware of a kind of resonance in the air around Harry that hadn't been there before, not visible the way it had been in the cupboard, but present in the way that the smell of rain is present before rain arrives. The family magic settling into its acknowledged position. Making itself known. Several goblins at their stations looked up as they passed. One of them, very old, with a face that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the Gringotts corridors, watched Harry until they reached the door, and Narcissa had been watching goblins for 30 years and had never quite seen that specific expression on one. They stepped out onto Diagon Alley. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning, and the alley was busy in its particular way, apothecaries and bookshops and robe-makers doing their business, witches and wizards moving along the cobbles, the smell of coffee from Madame Pudafoots and old parchment from Flourish and Blots. Harry stood on the steps of Gringotts and looked at all of it, and his face was entirely open in a way that it usually wasn't, the way any child's face is when they're presented with something that is simply, purely delightful. All of this is, he stopped. Tried again. I knew about it. The magic. I've always known it was real. But I didn't know it looked like this. There's more, Narcissa said. She was watching his face and finding it impossible not to. Hogsmeade. The Ministry. Hogwarts itself. She paused. The world is very large, Harry. He turned to look at her. His expression did something that she realized, going to spend a long time thinking about, something that was relief and wonder and the first proper showing of a grief that had been tucked very carefully away, the grief of a child who had lived for 6 years in a world that was stubbornly and deliberately small and who was only now understanding the full scale of what had been kept from him. He didn't cry. She thought he might, and she would have been completely unprepared for it, and she was almost grateful that he didn't, though the not crying was its own kind of statement. "Okay," he said, in that specific way of his. "Then, can we go to the bookshop?" They went to the bookshop. The news reached the Ministry of Magic at approximately 2 in the afternoon. Narcissa knew this with reasonable precision because Lucius's private network of information was very good, and because at 2:30 she received a small enchanted note through the manor fleur that said, in Lucius's handwriting, "Fudge knows. He's called Umbridge. Expect movement within 48 hours." She was in the library when it arrived, sitting across from Harry, who was working his way through the first third of a book about the history of wizarding Britain with the expression of someone eating something excellent. She read the note, set it face down on the arm of her chair, and spent about 30 seconds deciding what to do with it. "You should know something," she said. Harry looked up. "The Ministry has learned about the Heir Declaration. The Minister for Magic is a man named Cornelius Fudge. He is not, in my considered opinion, a bad man, but he is a frightened man, and frightened men in positions of power make decisions based on what protects their position rather than what is right." She paused. "He has an associate named Dolores Umbridge who is a more direct problem. She will be looking for a legal mechanism to challenge the claim or contain it." Harry looked at her steadily. "Can they do that?" "Challenge it, no. The Gringotts' confirmation is unassailable. Contain it." She thought about how to say the next part without being alarmist and decided alarmism was probably less damaging than inadequate preparation. "They may try to bring pressure. Social, legal, regulatory. The argument will likely be that a child of your age and background requires ministerial oversight of the Black estate management." She paused. "They would try to install one of their own people as your legal guardian. Instead of you." "Yes." Harry was quiet. He turned the book face down on his lap, carefully, not losing the page, and looked at the bookshelves for a moment. "What would that mean?" he said. "It would mean significantly less freedom and significantly more control. Like the Dursleys. That's the shape of it, yes." He processed this. She waited, because his processing was worth waiting for. "What can we do about it?" he said. "Not what can you do, we." She noted it. "The Black family seat on the Wiesengemot has already been transferred. Formally, as of this morning, you hold a vote in the governing body of Wizarding Britain." She paused. "You're 6. You can't exercise it personally until you're of age. But the seat's existence is the point. They cannot bring ministerial guardianship proceedings against someone with a seat on the body that would hear those proceedings. The conflict of interest alone would get it thrown out," Harry finished. He'd clearly read more about wizarding law in the last week than she'd deliberately shown him, which was entirely consistent with how he approached everything. "So the seat protects me." "For now, yes. But Umbridge is creative in her obstructions. We should expect a legal challenge to the seat itself, some technicality about age and standing. We need to be ahead of it." Harry picked up his book again and turned it the right way around. "Then we should find out what legal arguments she'll use before she makes them," he said. He said it simply, the way you said we should leave at 7 if we want to beat the traffic, and then went back to reading. Narcissa sat with her note and her thoughts for a moment. She had been prepared, she realized, for a child to be afraid. She had been prepared to manage that fear, to offer reassurance, to shield him from the more difficult realities until he was ready for them. What she had not been prepared for was a child who processed threat information the same way he processed book information, as material to work with, as a problem to solve, without the intermediary step of fear. She didn't know yet whether it was healthy. But it was something. Dolores Umbridge arrived the following afternoon. She arrived officially, which meant the manor wards received ministerial notification an hour in advance, which Narcissa was certain was intentional, not courtesy but tactical positioning, designed to give her time to prepare a defensive rather than an offensive posture. She prepared both. Umbridge came through the flue at 3 o'clock on the dot, which was also intentional. She was shorter than Narcissa had expected, which was saying something, because Narcissa's mental image of Umbridge had always been somewhat expansive, shaped by the woman's considerable political presence. In person she was compact, pink, and smiling with a warmth that was as genuine as a stage set. "Mrs. Malfoy," she said. "So lovely." "Dolores," Narcissa said. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Oh, just a quick visit, nothing formal," a wave of the hand, pink robes rustling. The minister simply wanted to extend his personal congratulations on the wonderful news, you know. The Black family claim, such an extraordinary development, the Black Heir declaration, Narcissa said. "Yes." Umbridge's smile was fixed with a precision that reminded Narcissa of the muggle nail guns she'd once seen in a muggle construction program Draco had found on their one functioning television set. "And the child, is he at home?" "We'd simply love to. The heir is not available for informal ministry visits," Narcissa said. A pause. Beneath the smile, something cool and precise was doing calculations. Of course. Though I do think, in the interests of the child's well-being, you understand, the ministry does have certain responsibilities with regard to, the heir of the House of Black holds the Black family Wisengamot seat, Narcissa said pleasantly. He is represented before the ministry by his guardian administrator. Any formal communications can go through the Malfoy solicitors or through the Gringotts account manager. She smiled. "Would you like some tea, Dolores?" The pause this time was longer. The calculation behind the smile was visible, just for a moment, before the smile recalibrated. "How kind. Perhaps just a quick cup." She settled onto the edge of the sitting room sofa and placed her hands in her lap with the air of someone who has decided to change tactics without abandoning the engagement. "And of course the child's welfare, we simply want to be certain he's in the very best possible environment." Given the circumstances of his previous care, Narcissa said, accepting the tea that Dobby produced and settling into the opposite chair with the comfortable authority of someone sitting at their own table, "are a matter I intend to raise with the full Wisengamot at the earliest opportunity." She looked at Umbridge pleasantly. Specifically, the question of who authorized those care arrangements and whether the authorizing party met their duty of care obligations under the child welfare provisions of the 1953 Wizarding Families Act. Umbridge had gone very still. "I'm not sure what you, Albus Dumbledore placed Harry Potter with a muggle family," Narcissa said, keeping her voice very even and very light. "I retrieved Harry Potter from a locked cupboard under the stairs of that family's house, malnourished and with evidence of physical injury. I have a diagnostic record from a qualified healer." She did, actually, she'd had the manor's private healer produce one the day after Harry arrived, because she'd known this moment was coming even if she hadn't known exactly when. "I'd be very interested to discuss, in a Wisengamot context, whether the ministry was aware of the conditions under which the boy who lived was being kept." The temperature in the room had changed. Umbridge's smile was still in place but it had gone rigid in a way that was almost interesting to look at. "I'm sure no one was aware of any, quite," Narcissa agreed. "Which is either a failure of oversight or a deliberate omission. Neither reflects particularly well on the ministry, does it?" There was a silence. Umbridge's hands in her lap were absolutely still, which was how you knew the rest of her was not. "Well," Umbridge said, in a voice that was still pink and smooth but now carried under it the specific quality of a woman who has decided to end a meeting she's losing, "I can see you have everything quite in hand." "I generally do. I'll pass on your regards to the minister." "Please do." She left through the flue with as much grace as an early departure permitted, and Narcissa sat in the sitting room for a moment and listened to the fire settle back to its ordinary register. That was well done. She turned. Harry was in the doorway to the corridor, which was slightly open. He had, she noted, been standing there for some time, or at least for the second half of the conversation. "You were listening," she said. Not accusatory. "I wanted to know what she was like," he said. "And?" He considered. "She smiles like my aunt does. When there are people watching." He came into the room and sat down in the chair Umbridge had recently vacated, crossing his ankles and looking at the fireplace. Then he looked at Narcissa. "I want to learn that," he said. "What you just did. The way you," he paused, looking for the right word. "The way you made her feel like she was losing before she even started." Narcissa looked at him. "That takes time." "I've got time." She thought about the Wizengamot. She thought about Fudge and Umbridge and the grinding institutional machinery of a ministry that had spent 5 years building a political structure premised on the boy who lived being safely elsewhere and controllable by proxy. She thought about what it would mean when Harry was old enough to walk into that building himself. She thought about what he'd be by then, if she did this properly. "Yes," she said. "You do." She began teaching him the following morning. Chapter 4, The Sorting and the Storm. 5 years moved the way they do when every day has something in it worth paying attention to. Harry grew. Not just in the obvious physical way, though he did that too, filling out properly once food was reliable and sleep was uninterrupted, losing the sunken look around the eyes, gaining a few inches every year until by 10 he was average height and at 11 was almost exactly Narcissa's shoulder, which she noted with a satisfaction she didn't bother to disguise. He grew in the other ways. The ways that Narcissa tracked with the attention she'd originally reserved for Draco's development and now found she was splitting, naturally, without effort, between them both. He read everything. That had been obvious from the first week, but the scale of it only became clear over time. By the time he was 8 he'd worked through most of the Manor Library's magical history collection and a significant portion of the law section, and Narcissa had taken him to Grimmauld Place for the first time, which had produced the precise reaction she'd expected. 2 hours of absolute silence while he moved through the shelves touching the spines of books like he was greeting old friends he hadn't known he had. Draco had lasted 40 minutes in the dark library before deciding the drawing room was more interesting. Harry had stayed until she made him leave for dinner. He learned the political lesson she'd started the morning after Umbridge's visit, and he learned it the way he learned everything, without apparent effort but with a retention that was occasionally unsettling. By 9 he could identify the internal fault lines of any Wizengamot faction from a basic description of their member composition. By 10 he had read enough about goblin banking law to occasionally correct Lucius, which Lucius managed with a frozen dignity that was, in its own way, a kind of adaptation. The magic came fully in at 8, the way it usually did, except in Harry's case it didn't arrive the way it arrived for most children, in small startled bursts that required correction and training. It arrived like a river finding a channel it had been waiting for, and it was extensive. Not flashy. Harry had, by 8, developed a marked dislike for magic as performance, which Narcissa suspected was a reaction against the way his childhood self had been punished for the accidental displays of it. When he used it with purpose, and the purpose was usually specific and the result was usually exact. Lucius watched all of this from a careful middle distance that had shifted, over 5 years, from cold assessment to something that was neither warm nor hostile but was, she thought, genuine respect, which from Lucius was rarer and more meaningful than warmth would have been. Draco and Harry were, by 11, simply Draco and Harry in the way that some pairings became a single entity in the minds of everyone around them, not identical, not always agreeing, not without the friction of 2 strong-willed people navigating shared space, but fundamentally, functionally inseparable. They argued about everything and agreed about the things that mattered. Draco had developed a bone-deep dislike of injustice that occasionally surprised even him, as though it had grown up in the space between his father's ideology and Harry's daily, unremarkable refusal to accept the logic of that ideology. Harry had developed a dry and occasionally devastating wit that was entirely his own but that had clearly been sharpened against 5 years of Draco's more performative humor. The Hogwarts letters arrived on a Tuesday in July. They arrived together, two identical envelopes, same green ink, same seal, and Harry stood in the entrance hall holding his for a moment before he opened it, and Narcissa watched his face with the attention she always gave to the moments she knew he'd remember. He read it once, quickly, and then he looked up and his face was doing the rare thing it did when something was exactly as good as he'd hoped. "September 1st, he said. "Yes," Narcissa said. He looked at the letter again. Then he folded it very carefully and put it in his pocket, and she could see him calibrating something, settling the enormous weight of it into the available space, making room. Draco, beside him, was reading his own letter with a running commentary about which classes were going to be best and which teachers he'd heard were terrible and whether they'd be able to get brooms in first year, all of which Harry let wash over him with a small private smile that was one of his most characteristic expressions. Lucius appeared at the top of the stairs, looked down at them, and said, "I trust you've both been accepted." "Obviously," Draco said. "Good. We'll go to Diagon Alley on Friday." He looked at Harry for a moment, the particular look he'd developed for Harry over 5 years, the look that was assessment and something the assessment was increasingly failing to fully account for, and then he looked back at Draco. "Don't forget you need new dress robes as well. The ones from last year are too short." He went back to his study. Harry looked at the space where he'd been. "He's pleased," Harry said. "He's not pleased," Narcissa said. "That's practically the same thing, for him." It was, actually. The Friday trip to Diagon Alley had the quality of a choreographed expedition, Lucius moving through the magical world with the gravity of someone who had been important in it for a very long time, Draco slightly ahead of his father with the energy of a person who had been important in a more recent way, and Harry beside Narcissa, seeing everything with the double vision he'd developed of someone who understood both how things worked and how they were supposed to appear to work. They were in flourish and blots when it started. The woman came in through the door while Harry was in the back section looking at the defense against the dark arts texts, and she was followed by a boy who was very clearly her son, and the boy was the kind of boy who had been raised with very specific ideas about very specific things and was starting to perform them in public. He looked around flourish and blots with the assessment of someone who has been told the world is ordered in a particular way and is checking to make sure it's still complying. He looked at Harry. "You're Harry Potter," he said. The recognition was immediate. Harry had been in the Prophet 3 times in 5 years, which was actually an extraordinary feat of information management that Narcissa was quietly proud of, but 3 was apparently enough. Harry looked up from the book he was examining. "Yes. I'm Gregory Goyle." The boy's tone carried the specific texture of someone announcing a title and waiting for the appropriate response. "My father knows your guardian's husband." "Lucius Malfoy," Harry said. "Yes, I know who your father is." A pause. The boy, Goyle, had not received the response he'd been calibrated to expect, and this had produced a small but visible uncertainty that he covered by drawing himself up slightly. "You're supposed to be some kind of heir." "I am an heir," Harry said. "Not supposed to be. My father says the claim is, your father," Harry said pleasantly, going back to the book, "isn't a Gringotts-certified bloodline assessor. Sharpclaw is." The claim was confirmed by all 16 symbols on the Black family stone 18 months ago. "If your father has concerns about goblin methodology, he's welcome to take them up with the Gringotts board." He turned a page. "Is there something specific you needed, or were you just stopping by?" Goyle stared at him. "Right," Harry said, and went back to reading. Narcissa, watching from the end of the aisle, caught the eye of Goyle's mother, who was standing near the entrance looking like she'd bitten something she hadn't expected. Narcissa gave her the small, precise smile she kept for exactly this kind of moment. The Goyles left shortly after without purchasing anything. Draco found Harry in the back section a few minutes later and said, "Did you just dismiss Goyle?" He was making a point in a roundabout way. "I addressed the point directly." Harry put down one book and picked up another. It seemed more efficient. "He's going to tell his father. His father can speak to Sharpclaw." Draco looked at him with the expression he wore when he was genuinely, reluctantly delighted by something. "You're going to be absolutely mental at Hogwarts," he said. "I'm going to be fine at Hogwarts," Harry said. "Also, this defense text is wrong in 2 places. We should mention it to whoever's teaching. You can't just tell a professor their textbook is wrong on the first day." "I can if it's wrong." Draco made the face. Harry bought the book. They boarded the Hogwarts Express on the 1st of September with the controlled chaos that platform 9 3/4 always was, families compressing 5 years of feeling into the last 4 minutes before the train moved, owls objecting, trunks being improperly managed. Narcissa found she had less to say than she'd expected, which was unusual for her, and which she eventually identified as the presence of something that was simply too complete for language. She kissed Draco on the forehead, which he tolerated with minimal fuss. Then she turned to Harry. He was looking at the train, and his face had the open quality again, the quality of a child presented with something simply, purely excellent, and then he turned and looked at her and the openness settled into something more direct. She put her hands on his shoulders. She was not, as a rule, given to grand speeches, because grand speeches were a form of performance and performance was one of the things she'd been slowly, stubbornly dismantling in herself over the last 5 years. "You know what you're doing," she said. "You know who you are. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I won't." "I know you won't," she said, and let him go. Lucius, standing slightly behind her, said nothing, which was his version of the same thing. The train was loud and full and Harry and Draco found a compartment and were joined by a girl named Pansy Parkinson who immediately began talking at high speed about Hogwarts, a boy named Knot who was quiet in a way that Harry registered as watchful rather than shy, and then, somewhat to everyone's surprise, a girl who was apparently on the wrong train and was slightly breathless about it. She had very large hair and a second-hand robe and she came into the compartment looking for a toad belonging to someone called Neville and she swept the whole group with a single assessing look and said, "Has anyone seen a toad? Brownish, quite round, probably terrified." "No toad," Harry said. "Are you looking for it or for its owner?" "Both." "Neville, Longbottom, first year, she paused, recognizing something. "You're Harry Potter." "Yes. I'm Hermione Granger." She said it with a brisk confidence that suggested she'd decided some time ago that the best way through situations was directly. "I've read about the Black Heir Declaration, it was in the Prophet 18 months ago, the legal analysis was very poorly written but the underlying facts were interesting." She looked around the compartment. "Is there room?" "Yes," said Harry, moving his bag. Draco looked at her, looked at Harry, looked at her again with the expression of someone recalibrating rapidly. "You read the legal analysis?" "I read everything I could find about wizarding law before coming. I'd never heard of any of it before my letter arrived. I thought it was best to be prepared." Hermione Granger, Knot said, slowly. "Your parents are dentists?" "Yes," Hermione said, settling in with the crisp efficiency of someone who has answered this question before and has decided not to be troubled by it. "Do you want to discuss dental care or can we find Neville's toad?" Harry found this very funny, which was visible only as a slight deepening of the composed expression, the tiny tell that Draco had learned over 5 years to recognize as Harry's equivalent of a full laugh. Knot, oddly, looked thoughtful rather than hostile. Pansy Parkinson was watching Hermione with the calculating attention of someone reassessing a first impression. They found Neville's toad 2 compartments down. Neville Longbottom was round-faced and earnest and looked as though he'd been slightly worried about something every day of his life and had made peace with that condition. He thanked them with a sincerity that was completely unguarded, and Harry said, "Keep him in your pocket, he'll be less likely to bolt," and showed him how the toad settled if you held it at a specific angle, which he appeared to know from having spent a quiet afternoon in the manor grounds reading about amphibian behavior, because that was the kind of thing Harry did. Neville came back to the compartment with them, holding his toad very carefully. By the time the train reached Hogsmeade Station, the 6 of them had talked for 3 hours about everything from the internal politics of Wisengamot factions to whether trolls were actually less intelligent than their size suggested, and the compartment had the particular atmosphere of a group of people who've been in a room together long enough to start finishing each other's sentences. Hogwarts, seen from the lake in the dark, was exactly what it was supposed to be, which was to say that it was enormous and very old and utterly indifferent to what anyone thought about it. Harry looked at it from the boat and said nothing, and Hermione said nothing beside him, and this was a companionable silence that had formed so naturally over 5 hours that it was already its own kind of communication. The castle received them. The Great Hall was exactly as described in every book Harry had read about it, and also entirely different, the way the best things always were: bigger, louder, more alive, the enchanted ceiling showing a clear autumn sky scattered with early stars that moved, fractionally, the way Real stars moved. The Sorting Hat sat on its stool. Professor McGonagall called names, and students went up, and the hat called houses in the big, unhurried voice it used, and the hall was appropriately loud and appropriately quiet at the right moments. Harry stood in the line of waiting students and watched the proceedings with his usual systematic attention and noticed several things simultaneously: the high table and the particular distribution of faculty expressions, Dumbledore at the center of it looking down at the first years with the assessing blue gaze that Harry had read about and was now reading in person for the first time, the way the Gryffindor table cheered differently from the Slytherin table cheered, the 4 distinct acoustics of 4 distinct cultures. He also noticed Dumbledore noticing him. It was not a subtle observation. Dumbledore's eyes found him in the line with the specificity of someone who knew exactly where to look, and the blue gaze was warm and sharp and carrying a significant quantity of information simultaneously, as advertised. Harry met it directly and held it until Dumbledore looked away, which took longer than Harry expected. He thought about what Narcissa had told him. About the blood wards and the calculation and the cost. He thought about it the way he'd been thinking about it for 5 years, not with rage, because rage was loud and imprecise, but with the particular cold clarity of someone who had filed something in a place where it would stay useful. Granger, Hermione. Hermione walked up with her chin level and her expression brisk. The hat sat on her head for about 10 seconds. Gryffindor. The Gryffindor table erupted. Hermione beamed with a completeness that Harry found genuinely moving, the beam of someone who had been told their whole life that they were too much and had just been placed in a house that appeared to want exactly as much as they had. Longbottom, Neville. The hat was on Neville for longer, and then, Gryffindor. Neville looked like he'd been told something that changed his understanding of himself, which was probably accurate. Malfoy, Draco. Draco walked up with the posture he'd inherited from Lucius and had recently started wearing with some irony, and the hat was barely touching his head before it said, Slytherin, with the certainty of something that had thought about this before. The Slytherin table applauded with restrained satisfaction. Draco sat down and looked back at Harry in the line with an expression that said, plainly, your turn. Potter, Harry. The hall had been making a steady background noise for the last 10 minutes. When McGonagall read that name it did something different, a kind of wave, not a single sound but the aggregate effect of 400 people having a quick individual reaction simultaneously, so that what the room did was exhale. Every face at every table turned. The high table shifted. Dumbledore was very still. Harry walked to the stool and sat down. The hat dropped over his eyes and the hall went dark. Well, said the hat, inside his head. It sounded, Harry thought, like the portraits at Grimmauld Place, old and dry and amused by things that weren't amusing to anyone else. This is unusual. Is it? Harry thought back. Oh yes. In a great many years of doing this, and it has been a great many years, I've had 2 students with this particular combination of bloodline and family magic active at full declaration. Neither of them were 11. You are presenting rather a lot of material to work with. Take whatever time you need. The hat seemed to appreciate this. Ravenclaw would be the obvious choice. The mind is extraordinary, you know that, I suspect you've always known it. But it's not purely intellect, is it? Its purpose. Everything you've learned has been in service of something. Yes, Harry thought. And that something is? He thought about the cupboard. He thought about 5 years of watching Narcissa maneuver through rooms full of people trying to diminish what they didn't control. He thought about Umbridge's smile. He thought about the Wisengamot seat and what it meant and what it would mean in 10 years if he used it properly. He thought about Hermione's face when the hat called Gryffindor, and Neville with his toad, and the fact that there were probably other children in cupboards right now and would be tomorrow. Justice, he thought. Not a word he'd have chosen out loud for its grandiosity. But inside his own head, it was exactly the right one. The hat was quiet for a moment. You know, it said, the Black family has never produced a Gryffindor. In 900 years. There's a first time for everything. And the Slytherin qualities? You have them. The strategic mind. The patience. The absolute refusal to be manageable. I know, Harry said. I'll use them wherever I end up. Yes, said the hat, and he could hear it making a decision. I believe you will. It paused for one more moment. Then, loudly, with the particular tone of an announcement that had been building for 900 years, Gryffindor. The hall's reaction was notable for several reasons. The Gryffindor table was the loudest it had been all evening, a wave of sound that was surprise and pleasure and the particular delight of receiving an unexpected and excellent gift. The Slytherin table was silence of the meaningful variety, and in the middle of it Draco Malfoy was wearing the expression of a person who has been surprised by a thing and is deciding how to feel about it, and arriving, somewhat to his own evident surprise, at a kind of reluctant pride. Dumbledore was applauding with everyone else, but his eyes were on Harry, and they were doing many things at once. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table. Hermione moved up immediately to make room. On his other side was a red-haired boy who'd come in on the boats and had been watching Harry with the open, uncomplicated attention of someone who hadn't preloaded any opinions yet. Ron Weasley, the boy said, extending a hand. Harry Potter. Yeah, I know. Not the way others said it, not weighted with the boy who lived significance. Just acknowledging the fact. Good hat deliberation, by the way. You had everyone sweating. The hat had a lot to say. Did it? Mine just said Gryffindor like it was obvious. Are you offended by that? Ron thought about it. Bit, yeah, he said, cheerfully. Harry looked at him. Decided. Good, he said. That's actually a better foundation than certainty. Ron looked at him sideways. That's a weird thing to say. Probably. Ron laughed, which was the uncomplicated, generous laugh of someone who found things funny without needing them to be performance. Harry decided he liked this, and filed Ron Weasley under things that were better than he'd expected, which was a growing list. The feast appeared. Harry ate and watched and listened, because that was what you did in a new environment on the first night. Dumbledore's opening remarks were charming and kind and contained a specific warmth when he mentioned the arrival of the new students, and the warmth was real. Harry did not think Dumbledore was a cold man. He thought Dumbledore was a man who was warm in the way that a very clever person sometimes was, warmly attached to the outcomes he believed in, capable of genuine affection for the people who served those outcomes, and capable of making very specific calculations about cost when the outcomes required it. After the feast, in the shuffle toward the common rooms, Dumbledore found him. Not publicly, he simply appeared at Harry's shoulder in the corridor as the students moved in their streams, appearing the way the very old and very powerful appeared when they decided to be where you were, with the absolute ease of a man who had never needed to hurry to be in the right place. Harry, he said. What a pleasure to finally meet you properly. Professor Dumbledore, Harry said. He didn't slow down. He let Dumbledore fall into step beside him, which reversed the usual dynamic of these introductions, and Dumbledore, he noted, absorbed this without comment. I hope the journey was comfortable. It was excellent. He paused. I sat with Hermione Granger. She's remarkable. I hear she is. The gentle smile. Harry, I hope that during your time here we might have the opportunity to talk, properly, at length. There are things about your history, your parents, that I think you should hear. Harry looked at him. He did not slow down. I'd be glad to hear about my parents, he said. I know a fair amount already. Mrs. Malfoy has been very thorough. She has been, I'm sure. A pause, and in the pause was a great deal that Dumbledore was choosing not to say, which Harry registered precisely. She is a capable woman. Yes, Harry said. She is. I only mean to say, the voice was gentle and careful, that there are perspectives on your situation that Mrs. Malfoy, through no fault of her own, isn't positioned to provide. About the war. About Voldemort. Harry did not flinch at the name, which he saw Dumbledore note. I know about Voldemort, he said. I know about the Horcrux theory. There are 2 papers on fragmentary soul magic in the Grimmauld Place Library that address the relevant mechanism, though they predate the specific term. He paused. I also know about the Privet Drive decision. The Blood Wards. A silence. They were approaching the staircase junction where the streams of students divided, Gryffindor going left, and Dumbledore had stopped walking without appearing to stop walking, which was a skill Harry appreciated even in the specific context of an opposition maneuver. I made choices, Dumbledore said quietly, that I believed were necessary. I did not make them lightly. I know, Harry said. He stopped too, now, because the conversation had arrived somewhere that deserved the stillness. He looked at Dumbledore, and Dumbledore looked at him, and 5 years of Narcissa's tutelage and 5 years of the most complete magical education she could provide and 5 years of being told over and over who he was and what he was worth all came to bear in the quality of that look, quiet and direct and entirely unafraid. I believe that you believed it was necessary. I believe you're a person who does hard things because you've decided they need doing. He paused. I just don't think it was your decision to make. Dumbledore was quiet. I should find the common room, Harry said. I don't want to keep Hermione waiting. She's already memorized the castle layout but she'll want to verify it against the actual architecture. And he went. He heard Dumbledore behind him, not following, just standing, and he did not look back, not because he was afraid to but because there was nothing more to say tonight and tomorrow was going to be long and there were things he needed to think through and a dormitory to find and 5 new faces to learn, and he was, if he was honest, quite hungry still because he'd spent the feast watching rather than eating. Hermione was at the junction waiting for him, as he'd expected. He stopped you, she said. We had a conversation. How was it? He thought about how to describe it. He's exactly what I expected, he said. Which is to say, extraordinary and quite certain he knows what's best for everyone, including people who haven't asked. He paused. He's going to be a challenge. Hermione looked at him with the direct, measuring look she developed over the course of the train journey, the look that was still forming its opinion but was committing hard to the process. Do you need help with it? He looked at her. Almost certainly. Good, she said, with a briskness that managed to sound like warmth. Then we'd better find this common room. I want to write to my parents tonight and I'll want a proper desk. They found the common room. The fire was already lit, the red and gold of it warm and loud and alive, and Harry stood in it for a moment and looked at the other faces. Ron Weasley sprawled across a chair already claiming territorial ownership of his space, Neville perched on a window seat with his toad, a dozen other first years finding their positions in the new geography of a place that would be home for 7 years. He thought about Draco, in the dungeons. He thought about Narcissa in Wiltshire. He thought about the letter in his trunk, the Hogwarts letter, still carefully folded. He thought about a boy on a broomstick in a crayon drawing on a cupboard wall, very high up, very free. He sat down by the fire. Chapter 5, The Hurricane. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in November, during Transfiguration. Harry was in the middle of turning a hedgehog into a very precise pincushion, precise because he'd decided that if a thing was worth doing it was worth doing exactly, and because the hedgehog's face deserved to be kept somewhere in the finished object, which earned him a look from McGonagall that was somewhere between startled and professionally approving, when the school owl came through the window and dropped an envelope on his desk with the focused urgency of an owl that had been told this was important and had taken it seriously. The envelope was from Narcissa. He knew her handwriting before he fully registered the seal, and he knew from the handwriting that something had happened, because Narcissa wrote with perfect control in ordinary circumstances, and this was slightly less perfect than usual, not dramatically, but enough. He read it under the desk. Sirius Black has escaped from Azkaban. The news is in this morning's Prophet. He has been at large for 3 days. The Ministry is treating this as an emergency. Come to the Slytherin Common Room at 8 tonight, I've arranged with Professor Snape. There are things you need to know before you hear them from someone else. Harry folded the letter and put it in his pocket and finished the transfiguration exercise and did not tell Hermione until the lesson ended, because there was nothing productive she could do with the information during class and she disliked being given incomplete information she couldn't act on. He told her in the corridor. She stopped walking. Sirius Black, she said, in the tone of someone running very fast through a large amount of stored information. Mass murderer. Azkaban, 12 years, he's a Death Eater, he betrayed your parents. That's what I was told, Harry said. By the Ministry. She looked at him sharply. You don't believe the Ministry. I believe the Ministry is capable of being wrong. He paused. I also don't have enough information to form a proper opinion yet. I'm going to Slytherin tonight, Narcissa sent word. Hermione processed this. I'll come. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She was already moving again. That's not the point. He looked at her. She looked back with the expression that had become very familiar over 3 months, the expression of someone who had decided that a thing was happening and was now in the business of making it happen as effectively as possible. He had never, in 5 years at the Manor, had a friend his own age who approached problems the way he did, with the same quality of direct engagement. It was, he'd decided, one of the better things about Hogwarts. Fine, he said. Come. Ron, when told at dinner, said, Blimey. I mean, the whole school knows, right? It's been the teacher's main topic since Monday. Sirius Black, murderer, etc. He speared a potato. My dad works at the Ministry, he sent a letter this morning saying not to go wandering around alone at night. Good advice in general, Harry said. Are you worried? Harry thought about this honestly. No, he said. Ron looked at him. He murdered 13 people. Blew up a street. That's what the Ministry says. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being relevant. Harry poured himself more water. I'll know more tonight. The Slytherin Common Room was colder than Gryffindor's in the way that stone rooms near water were always cold, but it had a different quality of atmosphere, denser, somehow, the green-tinged light from the lamps and the proximity of the lake making it feel like a room inside something rather than a room on top of something. Harry had been in it twice before, both times to find Draco after curfew to finish an argument they'd started during the day, and both times the Slytherin students had demonstrated a careful neutrality toward him that wasn't quite hostility and wasn't quite welcome but was fundamentally practical, which Harry respected. Draco was waiting by the fire when he and Hermione arrived, and he had the look he wore when he was managing something that was bigger than he'd let on. He looked at Hermione briefly and then at Harry with a directness that said there was no time for social navigation. She's through the back, Snape let her use his office. Come on. The office was small and smelled of potions ingredients and had a fire that was burning with a blue tinge that Harry recognized as a privacy ward. Narcissa was standing by the window, which looked out at the dark water, and she turned when they came in with the expression of someone who had been rehearsing what to say and was now deciding whether the rehearsal was any good. Harry, she said. Then, noting Hermione without surprise, Miss Granger. Mrs. Malfoy, Hermione said, with the precise courtesy she gave everyone she respected. Narcissa looked at Harry. Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban 3 days ago. The Ministry is treating this as the most significant security breach in their history, which is accurate. Azkaban has never had an escape. No one has ever. She paused, and Harry saw the thing in her face that she usually kept very well managed, the thing that was personal rather than strategic. He was my cousin, Harry. He was the heir of the House of Black before the heir declaration. Before you. Harry said, "What do you think he is?" She looked at him. "I think," she stopped. Started again. "I think the question of whether Sirius betrayed your parents is considerably less simple than the Ministry's account suggests, and I have thought that for 12 years, and I have had no way to act on it because there was nothing to act on and the cost of raising the question without evidence was too high." A pause. "He's escaped. Which means the question has a new set of possible answers." "They say he's after me," Harry said. "The Ministry says that. The Dementor reporting says that. His alleged motive, per the Ministry's account, is finishing what Voldemort started. What do you think his actual motive is?" Narcissa looked at him for a long moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that Sirius Black has been in Azkaban for 12 years for a crime that may not have happened the way the Ministry describes it. I think that the man I knew before the war," she stopped, and the stop was the kind that contained a great deal of compressed history, "was not a man who would have betrayed James Potter. Under any circumstances." The fire was the only sound for a moment. "Peter Pettigrew," Harry said. Narcissa blinked. Draco looked at him sharply. "The man who was supposedly killed by Black. Blew up the street, killed 12 muggles, nothing left of Pettigrew but a finger." He looked at Narcissa. "He was a secret keeper." "Yes. That's the established account. The established account says Black was the secret keeper for my parents' location. That he gave it to Voldemort and then killed Pettigrew when Pettigrew confronted him." He paused. "But if Pettigrew was the actual secret keeper, if they'd switched, then Black didn't betray my parents. Pettigrew did. And then Pettigrew blew up the street himself and framed Black and disappeared." The silence in the room was of the variety that happened when a thing that had been potential became actual. "You've been working on this," Narcissa said. "Since you told me about the war properly. 2 years ago." He paused. "I've never said it out loud before. I wasn't sure enough. And now? Now Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban, which no one has ever done, which takes something extraordinary, and the first thing the Ministry says is that he's coming for me." He looked at her. "Someone comes for the person they blame. Not the person they want to protect." Hermione said, very quietly, from beside the door, "Peter Pettigrew's body was never found." Everyone looked at her. "The finger," she said. "There was a finger. A single finger. Which is consistent with a staged death by someone who knew enough magic to." She paused. "I read everything I could find about the case when I found out about your parents. I found 4 inconsistencies in the Ministry's account. The finger was one." Harry looked at her. "I was going to tell you," she said. "I was waiting until I had more." "What are the other 3? There was no Auror investigation before Black was sent to Azkaban. No trial. He was detained at the scene and processed directly to prison by Bartemius Crouch Sr., who had emergency powers under the wartime provisions." She counted on her fingers. "He was never questioned under Veritaserum. His wand was never tested for the curse that killed the Muggles. And Dumbledore, who was secret keeper for the Order of the Phoenix, never made a public statement about the Potter's secret keeper despite knowing the operation structure." The fire crackled. Draco said, in a voice that was doing its best to be neutral, "So Black might be innocent." "It's possible," Narcissa said. I've thought it was possible for 12 years. And if he is, Draco said, and if he finds out about Harry, he's going to come here, Harry said. He said it without alarm. He's going to come to Hogwarts. Narcissa looked at him with the expression she wore when he'd arrived at a conclusion before she'd fully laid out the path, an expression that had moved over 5 years from surprise to something closer to a complicated pride. Yes, she said. I think he probably will. Then I'd rather meet him on my terms than his. A pause. You're 11 years old, Narcissa said. You're not saying that as though it's an argument. She looked at him. No, she said, and something in her face conceded the point. I'm not. He appeared at the end of November, and Harry knew before anyone officially confirmed it because the castle told him. Not literally, the castle didn't speak in words, but it had a quality that Harry had spent 3 months learning to read, the same way you learn to read weather from the sky or a person's mood from their posture. The night Sirius Black got into Hogwarts, the quality of the stone changed. The wards registered something that they hadn't been designed to register, someone moving through them with a familiarity that wasn't modern, a familiarity that went back to a student who'd walked these corridors before the wards were updated. Harry was awake when it happened because he was often awake at 11 o'clock, not from insomnia but from preference, the castle at night having a different character that he found useful for thinking. He was in the window seat of the Gryffindor Tower with a blanket and a book and he felt the ward shift and put the book down and thought about it for a moment. Then he got up and went out. He did not take the invisibility cloak, which he had, because the point was not to be invisible. He walked through the dark corridors with the quiet step he'd had since childhood and the map he'd made in his 3rd week at Hogwarts, not the Marauder's map, though he'd heard of it, his own map, drawn from his own exploration, annotated with the castle's patterns. He followed the pattern of the intrusion. He found Sirius Black on the 4th floor, in a disused classroom near the History of Magic corridor, and Sirius Black found him at exactly the same moment, because Sirius Black had apparently been walking through the castle with the specific quality of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had not expected to be walked toward. They stood in a corridor lit by a single torch, 10 feet apart, and looked at each other. Sirius Black was, by any measure, terrible to look at. 12 years of Azkaban had made him into something that was recognizably human but carrying the extreme edge of what human endurance could produce, too thin, too gray, with the eyes of someone who had been somewhere that light didn't reach and hadn't quite come all the way back. But the eyes themselves, once you looked past the damage, were not the eyes of a man without a mind. They were sharp, and they were, looking at Harry, doing something complicated that Harry watched with the attention he gave to important things. Sirius said, in a voice that was rough from disuse but not from madness, "James." Then, correcting immediately, his face doing something that was painful to witness, "No. No, you're not, you have her eyes. You're Harry." "Yes," Harry said. Sirius looked at him. Harry looked at Sirius. The torch between them did its ordinary work. "You're not afraid," Sirius said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something closer to bewilderment. "Should I be? The whole school's been told I'm here to kill you." "The whole school's been told a lot of things by the Ministry," Harry said. "I've learned to verify." He paused. "You didn't betray my parents." Sirius went absolutely still. "Peter Pettigrew was the secret keeper," Harry said. "They switched. He betrayed them to Voldemort and then blew up the street himself and framed you and faked his death. He's been in hiding for 12 years, presumably as an animagus in a form that makes identification impossible." He paused. "A rat, I'd guess. Rats are practical for long-term concealment." Sirius stared at him. His expression was doing things that were beyond the ordinary range of what a face should do, not instability, but the look of a man who had been carrying 12 years of one particular weight and had just had it redistributed in a way that his body hadn't caught up with yet. "How do you know that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I worked it out. With some help." He paused. Hermione found 4 inconsistencies in the Ministry's account. The no trial thing bothered me most, actually. The Ministry put you in Azkaban without a trial. Even during wartime it was Crouch, Sirius said, and his voice had changed, going harder, the grief sharpening into something more functional. Bartemius Crouch. He had emergency provisions. He used them. I know. Harry looked at him. You escaped because of me. The Heir Declaration, you heard about it. Sirius blinked. The shift of topic seemed to unbalance him, which was perhaps the point. I heard the Dementors talking. They don't talk to prisoners, but they forget we can hear the guards sometimes. The guards were talking about the Black Heir. About a boy. I thought, he stopped. I thought someone had finally done something stupid with the Black family magic. I thought maybe it was Bellatrix's doing, some posthumous claim, Bellatrix is in Azkaban. I know. I shared a prison with her for 12 years. His voice was flat. She's insane. She was before Azkaban and Azkaban made it worse. The claim is mine, Harry said. The Black family stone activated all 16 symbols. Another silence. Sirius was looking at him with an expression that Harry found genuinely difficult to categorize, which was unusual because he was generally quite good at categorizing expressions. It was recognition, and grief, and something that was neither of those things but contained both. You're James and Lily's son, Sirius said. And Doria's grandchild. And you're he stopped. Narcissa? She found me, Harry said. I was at the Dursleys. Something moved in Sirius's face. Dumbledore placed you with the Dursleys. Yes. And Narcissa took you in. Yes. He laughed, which was a sound that had clearly been in storage for some time and emerged somewhat at an angle. It wasn't a happy laugh, but it was a real one. Lily would have found that absolutely extraordinary, he said. Then, more quietly, how was it? With the Dursleys. Harry looked at him. Bad, he said. Precisely, and without decoration, because Sirius didn't need protection from the truth any more than Harry needed protection from it. For a while. Then Narcissa opened the cupboard door and that was the end of it. Sirius made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I have healed rib fractures, Harry said. I have a permanent healer's diagnostic record. I intend to use it. He paused. Eventually. Against Dumbledore? Against the people who knew and made the calculation that it was worth it. He paused. I don't think Dumbledore is a monster. I think he's a man who decided he knew the shape of the necessary thing and then made everything fit it. I intend to have a conversation about it when I'm 17 and have a full Wisengamot seat. Sirius looked at him for a long time. The torch light moved between them. You sound like her, he said. Narcissa. The way she talks. She taught me. She would have. A pause. She was the clever one. People always said Bellatrix was the powerful one, and Andy was the compassionate one, and Narcissa was the beautiful one, and all of that it missed the point. She was the one who paid attention. She always, he stopped. She was kind to me when we were young. Before everything. He looked at his hands, which were not in good condition, 12 years of nothing having done what you'd expect 12 years of nothing to do. I need you to know that I'm not what they say. I'm not going to, I know, Harry said. I told you I know. You're 11. People keep saying that like it changes the information. He looked at Sirius levelly. You're going to have to turn yourself in. Or let me clear your name through the proper channels. Or both, probably in that order. Sirius stared at him. I have the Black family seat on the Wisengamot. Narcissa is guardian administrator. We have resources and we have standing and we have a case that, properly presented, is solid enough to force a real investigation. He paused. But you have to not get caught by the ministry before we're ready, because if they catch you before we have the evidence formalized, Fudge will use emergency provisions to skip the trial again and have you back in Azkaban or kissed within a week. The Dementors performing the kiss on me would be, they nearly got me several times already. Sirius said it with the flat effect of someone reporting a weather hazard, and Harry recognized the register because he used it himself when discussing his own unpleasant history. So stay out of their reach until we're ready. Can you do that? Where would I know where Grimmauld Place is, Harry said. The Black Estate properties belong to me. Number 12 is warded, unplottable, and the wards will recognize your bloodline. He paused. You'd need to stay inside. You'd need to let me manage the legal situation from here. And you'd need to trust that I know what I'm doing. Sirius Black, who had spent 12 years in Azkaban and had escaped through sheer willpower and was currently sitting in a castle corridor at midnight looking at an 11-year-old who had just laid out a complete strategic plan for his exoneration, said, "You're really James's son, aren't you?" "I'm told I have his hair," Harry said. "You have his hair and her mind," and Sirius stopped, and the grief moved through his face again, openly this time, no attempt to contain it. "And something that's entirely your own." Harry looked at him. He thought about the photograph he still carried, the one from the cupboard, the two laughing people in the moving image. He thought about it every day and had kept it because it was the only thing from before, the only thread back to what had been taken. "I want to hear about them," he said. "My parents. When this is over and it's safe, I want to hear everything." Sirius's face did the thing again, the redistribution of 12 years of weight. "Yes," he said roughly. "Anything you want to know." "Okay." Harry straightened. "Then this is what we're going to do." He told him. He laid it out in the same way he laid out any plan, sequentially, accounting for variables, identifying the contingencies that needed preparation. Grimmauld Place first, tonight if possible. Hedwig to Narcissa in the morning with a message he'd already half composed in his head on the walk up here. The Pettigrew question, which was the crux of everything and which required either finding Pettigrew directly or finding evidence compelling enough to force a reinvestigation. The Wisengamot timing, which Narcissa could advise on. The question of whether to involve Dumbledore, which Harry's opinion on was no, for now, because Dumbledore's involvement would shift the center of gravity of any proceeding toward Dumbledore's objectives, and Harry's objectives were not identical to Dumbledore's objectives. Sirius listened to all of it with his forearms on his knees and his damaged, attentive eyes fixed on Harry's face. When Harry finished, Sirius said, "Pettigrew. You said a rat. It's the most practical animagus form for permanent concealment. He always did like being somewhere small and safe," Sirius said, very quietly. "You know where he might be." A pause that was longer than the others. "The Weasleys have a rat," Sirius said. "They've had him for years. Old, gray, missing a toe." He looked at Harry. Animagus transformation, missing a finger could look like a missing toe, depending on the original form. Harry was very still for a moment, running the mathematics of this. "Ron Weasley," he said. "Your friend? His rat is called Scabbers." He paused. "He's had him for 12 years. The corridor was very quiet. "I need to think about how to handle this," Harry said, not to Sirius but to himself, working through it. "Ron can't know until we're ready to move on it. If Pettigrew realizes he's been identified he'll bolt and we lose the evidence." He looked at Sirius. "Can you get to London?" "In my animagus form. The Dementors can't identify a dog." "Good. Go to Grimmauld Place. There's food in the kitchen, the house elves are keyed to Black bloodline, they'll recognize you. Don't leave. I'll get word to Narcissa tonight." He stood up. Sirius stood up too, because when Harry moved there was a quality to the movement that made people adjust. He was looking at Harry with the expression that had become slightly more legible over the course of the last 40 minutes. It was the expression of a man who had expected to be on the wrong end of everything and had found himself, inexplicably and specifically, on the right end of something instead. Not certain yet, but oriented toward something other than loss. "Harry," he said. Harry looked at him. "Thank you," Sirius said. It was not a casual thank you. "I know," Harry said. "You can tell me about my parents when this is done." Sirius nodded. Something settled in his face. "Go," Harry said. "The castle shift changes at 1. You've got 20 minutes. Sirius Black, who had been the most wanted man in Britain for 3 days, transformed, a large, gaunt dog, dark grey, with eyes that were still recognizably his, and went. Harry stood in the corridor for a moment in the dark after he'd gone, and the castle was quiet around him, the stones doing their ordinary old work, the wards maintaining their long-established patterns, the torch burning beside him with its small persistent commitment. Then he went back to Gryffindor Tower and sat at the desk by his bed and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Narcissa and was clear and specific and covered all the operational necessities. The second was shorter, and he held it for a moment after he'd sealed it, because the second was to Lucius, and what the second said was this: "Sirius Black is innocent. I know where he is. I need your Wizengamot contacts. Not for you or for me, for the truth. I think you know the difference. Please let me know if I'm wrong about that." He looked at the letter for a moment. Then he tied them both to Hedwig's leg, told her which was which, and sent her into the dark. He sat at the desk after she'd gone and thought about a lot of things, and then he thought about Ron Weasley's rat sitting in Ron Weasley's pocket in the dormitory across the room, sleeping the sleep of a man who'd been hiding for 12 years, and he looked at the dormitory door. Then he looked away. Not yet. There was an order to things, and getting the order right was the whole difference between justice and chaos, and justice was the point. He went to bed. He did not sleep for some time, but that was fine. He was used to thinking in the dark. He'd had a lot of practice. Chapter 6, The Heir Speaks. The Wizengamot chamber was exactly as cold as Harry had expected. He'd read the architectural description in 3 separate texts and had looked at the engraving in A History of Magical Governance until he could have drawn it from memory, but descriptions and engravings missed the specific quality of the cold of a room where a great deal of power had been concentrated for a very long time and had leached into the stone, the cold of a place that had witnessed too many decisions made by people who'd convinced themselves the decisions were necessary. He sat in the Black family seat and felt the cold and did not find it intimidating. The seat was in the upper tier, 3rd from the left, and it was a better position than it looked, slightly elevated, excellent sightlines across the chamber floor, and situated in such a way that you could observe the expressions of the people directly across without being obviously observed doing it. Someone in the Black family had chosen it with care, some centuries back, and Harry appreciated the geometry. Narcissa was in the gallery above, which was where non-Wizengamot parties sat during open proceedings. She had her hands folded in her lap and her face in the expression that meant she was paying attention to everything simultaneously. Lucius was beside her, which had been his decision and which Harry had found, when Hedwig came back with his response letter, more informative than anything Lucius had said in 5 years. The letter had said, "My contacts are at your disposal. Don't lose." Draco was at Hogwarts, which he was furious about and had communicated through a letter that was impressively articulate in its fury for a first year. Harry had written back, "Someone needs to watch Scabbers. I trust you." Which had stopped the fury immediately, replaced by the sharp focus that Draco brought to anything he was actually needed for. Hermione was also at Hogwarts, which she was not furious about because she was managing something more important. She had spent the 3 weeks since Harry's midnight meeting with Sirius compiling the legal brief that Harry was going to present today, working from the Grimmauld Place library through the flu under the pretense of a research project, producing 112 pages of documented inconsistency in the Ministry's original case against Sirius Black that was, in Harry's assessment, the most thorough piece of legal work he'd seen since Narcissa's response to Umbridge's first challenge. She'd sent it with a note that said, "I've flagged the 3 strongest arguments in red. Lead with the no-trial provision, it's the cleanest. Don't let them redirect to character evidence, that's where they'll try to muddy it." He'd written back, "I know. Thank you." And then, because she'd been working 18-hour days for 3 weeks, "When this is done, we're getting you a proper desk in the Grimmauld Place library." Her reply had been one word, yes. The chamber was filling. 50 seats in the tiered semicircle, purple robes, the particular mixture of boredom and alertness that defined a governing body that had been governing for long enough to have developed institutional habits. Harry watched them take their seats and identified, from the dossiers Narcissa had provided, the faction alignments, the personal histories, the pressure points and the principled positions and the people who had the latter but were susceptible to the former. Cornelius Fudge arrived with the specific energy of a man who had been having a terrible month and was managing it with aggressive proceduralism. He wore his lime-green bowler hat and his expression of controlled alarm, and he sat in the Chief Warlock's chair, the chair in the center of the chamber floor, elevated, where witnesses stood and where the Wisengamot's power concentrated for formal proceedings, and he looked around the chamber with the look of a man counting allies. He found fewer than he'd expected. Harry had ensured that Lucius's contacts had been useful not in the way Lucius usually used them, not leverage, not debt calling, not the transactional currency of favors owed. Harry had asked Narcissa to use them differently, to make the case on its merits to anyone who could be reached on those terms, to find the people in the Wisengamot who had voted for the wartime emergency provisions in 1981 and who had been quietly uncomfortable about them ever since, and to find the people who cared about procedural legitimacy even when the procedural outcome was inconvenient. She'd found 11. 11 plus the Black family seat was 12, which was not a majority but was enough to force a full evidential hearing rather than the summary dismissal Fudge had been hoping to achieve. The motion had been filed 3 days ago through the Black family solicitors, and Fudge had been attempting to have it procedurally blocked ever since, and had failed, because the motion was founded on the 1822 wizarding rights provision that Hermione had identified as the relevant statute and which predated every emergency provision Fudge could cite. Dolores Umbridge was seated 2 positions to Fudge's left. She looked, Harry thought, like a woman who had been planning this room for a long time and was now facing an adjustment to those plans. She was composed with the specific composure of someone managing genuine anger, which was different from Narcissa's composure, which was the composure of someone who was simply where they'd intended to be. Umbridge looked across the chamber and found Harry's seat. He was already looking at her. He gave her the small, precise smile that Narcissa had spent 5 years teaching him, the smile that said, "I know what you're planning and I've already addressed it." It was a very specific smile and it took practice. Umbridge's composure flickered, very slightly. "Good." Fudge called the chamber to order. The formal title of the proceeding was in the matter of the unlawful detention of Sirius Orain Black, application for evidential review under the 1822 rights provision, submitted by the House of Black. It was a dry title that did not begin to describe what today actually was, which was a reckoning, but formal titles rarely described what things actually were. Fudge said, "The motion before us has been submitted by the Black family seat, currently held by." He looked at his papers with the expression of a man who found the name on those papers personally offensive, Harry James Potter, designated Black Heir. As the submitting party is below the age of Wisengamot participation under ordinary standing, we would normally expect the motion to be presented by the Guardian Administrator, Narcissa Malfoy. The submitting party will be presenting the motion personally, Harry said. The chamber's ambient sound changed. Fudge looked up. "I beg your pardon." "The Black family seat is my seat," Harry said. He kept his voice level and unhurried, the way Narcissa had kept her voice when she was telling you something that wasn't open for negotiation. "The motion was filed in my name. I will present it. The Wisengamot's age restrictions apply to elected representation. The Black family seat is hereditary and the rights provision explicitly exempts hereditary seats from age restrictions during formal evidential hearings." He paused. Page 47 of the motion, footnote 12. If the chief warlock requires the relevant statute, I have a copy. A silence. Fudge was looking at him with an expression that was cycling through several stages. Across the chamber, 3 of the 11 faces Harry had identified as potential allies were making very small but legible adjustments in their posture. The chamber will note the submitting parties, Fudge visibly reorganized. Very well. The chair recognizes the House of Black. Harry stood. He had thought about this moment for 3 years. Not obsessed over it, not rehearsed it in the mirror, not built it into something larger than it was. He'd thought about it the way he thought about any problem, by understanding what needed to happen and what was in the way, and then working out how to make the former happen despite the latter. What needed to happen was that Sirius Black needed to not be a fugitive by the end of today. What was in the way was a ministry that had built 12 years of institutional narrative around Sirius Black's guilt and would find its credibility significantly damaged if that narrative was undone. That was the irreducible shape of it, and everything else was detail. Members of the Wisengamot, he said. The motion before this body is not complicated. I want to be clear about that at the outset, because there will be attempts today to make it seem complicated, and those attempts will be worth examining carefully when they occur. He looked at the chamber, unhurried, and the chamber looked back. Sirius Black was imprisoned in Azkaban in November 1981 without a trial. That is not a claim. That is a documented fact. It is in the ministry's own records. He was detained at the scene of a crime, processed directly to Azkaban under emergency wartime provisions invoked by Bartemius Crouch Sr., and imprisoned for 12 years without ever being questioned under Veritaserum, without his wand being tested for the curses attributed to him, and without a single formal judicial proceeding of any kind. He paused. Let that sit. The 1822 Wizarding Rights provision, he continued, which is the oldest statute in this chamber's founding documents and which has never been repealed, states explicitly that no witch or wizard may be imprisoned for more than 72 hours without either a formal trial or a Veritaserum examination before a qualified judicial officer. This provision does not have a wartime exemption. It was written without a wartime exemption deliberately, by people who understood that wartime was precisely when such exemptions became most dangerous. Umbridge said, the emergency provisions of 1981 were invoked for detention purposes only, Harry said, without looking at her, because looking at her would suggest she'd said something that required his full attention. The emergency provisions authorized extended detention pending trial. They did not and could not override the rights provisions trial requirement. The trial simply never happened. Which means that Sirius Black has been imprisoned for 12 years in direct violation of the most fundamental legal protection in Wizarding Britain. He paused. That is what this proceeding is about. Not whether Sirius Black is guilty or innocent, the evidential question is separate and will be addressed. This proceeding is about whether this body is willing to acknowledge that its own foundational law was violated. Because if it is not willing to acknowledge that, I would suggest the chamber consider carefully what that implies about every other right this body claims to protect. The chamber was very quiet. Fudge said, the emergency provisions were not sufficient, Harry said. Page 47, footnote 12, as I mentioned. One of the 11, an older witch named Augusta Longbottom, Neville's grandmother, who had a face like weathered granite and opinions like the granite underneath, said, from her seat, the submitting party is correct about the statute. I reviewed the rights provision last night. The wartime emergency provisions did not suspend it. Another voice, a wizard named Griselda Marchbanks, nor have I found any record of a dispensation from the provision being sought or granted. Fudge was going red. The extraordinary circumstances of the time were extraordinary, Harry said, and did not make the law optional. He reached into the document folder on the desk before him and produced 3 sheets, which he directed to the chamber through the standard distribution charm, a copy appearing on every Wisengamot member's desk simultaneously. These are the relevant sections of the ministry's own records of Sirius Black's processing in November 1981. The provision violation is documented on page 1. The chamber absorbed this. The sound of 50 people reading was a specific sound, a concentrated silence that wasn't silent. Umbridge's voice, from her seat, was very careful. The submitting party is conflating a procedural irregularity with an exoneration. The lack of a formal trial does not in itself speak to the question of guilt. It doesn't, Harry agreed. Which is why I'm going to speak to the question of guilt separately. He looked at her now, because now was the moment for it, because she'd walked into the place he'd prepared. But I'd like the chamber to note that the ministry's representative has just characterized an 11-year imprisonment without trial as a procedural irregularity. In the gallery, he heard a sound that might, from a certain angle, have been Narcissa laughing. Several Wizengamot members were looking at Umbridge with expressions that ranged from discomfort to outright distance. Augusta Longbottom's expression had not changed because it never changed, but she had turned very slightly in her seat to look at Umbridge, which from Longbottom had the quality of a pronouncement. The evidential case, Harry said, moving forward, is this. The ministry's account holds that Sirius Black was the secret keeper for the Fidelius charm protecting James and Lily Potter. That he gave the location to Voldemort. That when confronted by Peter Pettigrew, he killed Pettigrew and 12 muggles. That only a finger of Pettigrew remained. He paused. I want to examine each of these claims individually. He took them in turn. He was precise and he was not fast. Speed was for people who needed to prevent the other side from thinking, and he wanted this chamber thinking, because what he was showing them was the kind of thing that only became fully visible when you had time to look at it properly. The secret keeper claim, no documentation of the original Fidelius arrangement, only testimony from a single source, Albus Dumbledore, and Dumbledore had never been formally questioned on the operational structure of the Order's protective arrangements. The wand evidence, Sirius Black's wand had never been tested. A priori incantatem would have shown definitively whether it had cast the curse that killed the Muggles. The wand had been stored in the Ministry Evidence Vault since 1981. Untested. The body, Peter Pettigrew's death had been attributed to Sirius Black on the basis of the crowd's accounts and the single severed finger. No healers had attended. No forensic magical examination of the scene had been conducted before it was cleared. And then, Peter Pettigrew was a registered, or should have been a registered, animagus. He was not registered. The animagus registry has no record of Pettigrew. This is consistent with either of two conclusions, that Pettigrew was not an animagus, or that he deliberately avoided registration, which would be consistent with someone planning to use their animagus form for concealment purposes. He reached back into the folder and produced the photograph. It was a copy, the original was at Grimmauld Place, but the copy was clear enough. It showed a family named Weasley, taken at some ministry event in the early 1980s, Arthur Weasley and Molly Weasley and several small red-haired children, and on Arthur Weasley's shoulder, looking directly at the camera with small, bright eyes, was a rat. This is a photograph from the ministry's own archive, Harry said. It was taken at a ministry family event in 1983. On the shoulder of Arthur Weasley, a ministry employee, is a rat that has been in the Weasley family for 12 years. The rat is missing a toe on its right front paw. The rat is significantly older than the natural lifespan of a common rat, which is 3 to 4 years, and is still, to my knowledge, alive. He paused. An animagus in animal form does not age at the rate of a natural animal. They age at the rate of a wizard. The chamber was absolutely silent. I am requesting, Harry said, that the Wizengamot issue a formal order for the examination of the Weasley family rat, currently in residence at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, by a qualified magical examiner authorized to perform animagus revelation. I am requesting that this order be issued today, under the emergency provisions of the Rights Procedure Act, on the grounds that the subject may attempt to flee if given advance notice. He put the photograph on the desk. I am also requesting that the Wizengamot issue an immediate stay of any and all Dementor orders regarding Sirius Black pending the completion of this review, on the grounds that the Dementor's kiss, if performed on a potentially innocent man, constitutes an irreversible action and therefore requires a higher evidential standard than has currently been met. He looked at Fudge. The higher standard being, in this case, a trial. Which has not happened. He sat down. The chamber erupted. Not chaotically, it was a governing body, it had procedures for eruption, but with the energy of 50 people who had all been given something significant and were now dealing with it in their various individual ways. Fudge was on his feet. Umbridge was on her feet. Augusta Longbottom remained seated, which was its own kind of statement. Marchbanks was already in conversation with two colleagues. Across the chamber a witch named Amelia Bones, who headed the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and who had been listening to Harry's presentation with the focused stillness of a woman whose entire professional life was the law, had her eyes on the photograph. Amelia Bones was not on Harry's list of 11. She was a wild card, principled, he thought, genuinely principled, but the ministry's head of law enforcement being genuinely principled could cut in either direction depending on what she decided the principle was. She stood. The chamber quieted, because her standing had authority. "I have a question for the submitting party," she said. Harry looked at her. "The rat," she said. "Your knowledge of its whereabouts. The photograph from the archive. You've prepared this case over a period of, how long?" 3 weeks of formal preparation, Harry said. 3 years of informal. Something moved in her face. "And you are 11 years old." "Yes." A pause. "The wand in the evidence vault," she said. "Are you certain it's never been tested?" "The vault access logs for the period 1981 to present are in Appendix 3, he said. "The wand entry shows 1 deposit and no retrievals." She looked at the document folder on his desk. "You have the vault access logs." "My solicitor submitted a formal evidence request under the records transparency provision 6 weeks ago. The ministry complied after the second request." Her expression was, he thought, what it looked like when someone was recalibrating comprehensively. She sat down. Then she stood back up. "I move that the Wisengamot grant all 3 requests from the House of Black," she said. "The Dementor stay. The examination order. And, formally, for the record, a full investigation into the circumstances of Sirius Black's original detention, to be conducted by my department independent of any other ministry oversight." Fudge said, "Amelia, Cornelius, the wand has been in the vault for 12 years untested," she said, with the patience of someone explaining something to a person who already knew it. "If we test it and it has the curse, the case is closed. If we test it and it doesn't, we have a very serious problem that needs addressing. Either way, the test should have happened in 1981. A second followed. Fudge looked at the chamber around him. He was counting, Harry knew, and the count was not going the way he needed it to go, because 11 of his members were looking at Amelia Bones with the expressions of people who had been given permission to land somewhere they'd been circling for a while, and Amelia Bones's motion had shifted the moral geometry of the room. "I second the motion," said Augusta Longbottom. That was enough. The vote was 31 to 19 in favor. The Dementor stay was granted. The examination order was issued. The independent investigation was authorized. Fudge accepted the result with the specific rigidity of a man who was going to have a great deal to manage in the coming weeks, and Harry watched him and felt not triumph. Triumph was loud and imprecise, but something more like the quiet satisfaction of a thing done correctly. Umbridge's face, when Harry looked at it, was the face of someone updating a set of plans. Not defeated. Not finished. Moving to the next angle. He noted it and kept it. The chamber began to clear. Harry remained in the Black family seat for a moment, the documents in front of him, and thought about the particular shape of what had just happened, not the legal result but the other thing, the thing underneath it, the thing that had started in a cold corridor in November when a damaged man had looked at him in torchlight and said James, and had been building toward this room ever since. He gathered his documents. Amelia Bones appeared beside the seat as he stood. Mr. Potter, she said. Madam Bones. She looked at him with an assessment that was neither warm nor cold but was precisely calibrated. The brief you submitted, she said. It's the most thorough piece of private legal work I've seen in 20 years of law enforcement. Hermione Granger wrote most of it, Harry said. She's a first year at Hogwarts. Muggle-born. I'd appreciate it if you remembered that. A pause. I'll remember it, Bones said, with a faint inflection that suggested she found this interesting. The independence of the investigation I moved for, I want you to understand that means independent of you as well. Of the House of Black. I'll go where the evidence takes me. Good, Harry said. That's exactly what I want. She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded, once, and left. He came up into the gallery through the side stair and found Narcissa and Lucius exactly where he'd left them. Narcissa stood when he reached them and she looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the room was still full of people and also because the moment was one of those that was simply too complete for the usual dimensions of language. The footnotes, she said finally. Hermione flagged them. I noticed. A pause. You didn't lead with them. Bones needed to find them herself. If I'd pointed at them directly she'd have defended them. Narcissa looked at him. Something moved in her face that was not the composed, managed expressions he'd learned to read over 5 years, something more open than that, something that was simply and entirely present. Your father, she said quietly, would have argued it loudly and brilliantly and carried the room on charisma. I know, Harry said. I've read about him. Your mother would have found the footnotes before anyone else and had 3 responses ready. I know that too. She looked at him. And you found a way that was entirely your own. He held her gaze. He thought about the cupboard. He thought about the bolt on the outside of the door, and the thin blanket, and the drawings on the wall. He thought about 2 cups of tea at 6 in the morning and a book about goblin banking history and a woman who had opened a door for no better reason than that a child needed it open. You taught me, he said. I gave you the tools, she said. The rest was always yours. Lucius, who had been standing slightly apart with his hands behind his back in the posture of a man who was experiencing something he hadn't prepared for, said nothing. But when Harry turned he found Lucius looking at him with an expression he had never seen on Lucius Malfoy's face in 5 years, an expression that had finally found its way through the cold management and the careful distance and the transactional calculations. It was, Harry thought, respect of the uncalculated variety, the kind that happened to you rather than being chosen. Lucius said, the vault access logs were a particularly good detail. It was, from Lucius, essentially a declaration of devotion. Thank you, Harry said. They went back to Hogwarts by early evening, Narcissa taking him through the flue, and the first thing that happened when he came through the common room fire was that Hermione looked up from her desk, saw his face, and said, It worked. It worked. She closed her book. The stay? Granted. Independent investigation authorized. Examination order issued for Scabbers. She was quiet for a moment, the quality of quiet that was her version of taking a breath. Then, Scabbers. Ron is not going to take this well. I know. He sat down. He'll understand eventually. It's worse to let it go. I know it is. She paused. When do they send the examination team? Bones said 48 hours. She nodded. Then we need to tell Ron before they arrive. He should hear it from us. Harry looked at her. I know. He paused. You should be there when I tell him. He trusts you. He barely knows me. He trusts you, Harry said. He notices how you think. He just doesn't say it like that. Hermione looked at him with the particular expression she wore when she was deciding whether to be touched by something or analytical about it, and landing, as she usually did when it counted, on both. Fine, she said. Tomorrow morning before breakfast. Ron, the following morning, took it badly and then took it correctly. The badly came first, the disbelief, the defensive loyalty, the working through of what it would mean if the rat he'd carried around for years had been a man the whole time. Harry and Hermione let him work through it without pushing, because the shape of Ron's character was that he needed to reach his own conclusions and the best thing you could do was give him all the information and then step back. The correctly came about 20 minutes in, when Ron said, very quietly, "He was in my pocket. All the time. He knew everything about my family." A pause. "He's the reason your parents are dead." "Yes," Harry said. Ron looked at him. "And Sirius didn't do it?" "No. So Sirius Black is, in London. Waiting." Ron sat with this for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and took out Scabbers, who looked at them with his small bright eyes and did not look at all like a man trying to appear relaxed because he had no idea what was in the facial expression of a rat and neither did they, probably, but Harry had been watching those eyes for months and they were not the eyes of a rat. "Here," Ron said, and handed the rat to Harry. Harry took him. Scabbers sat in his palm and was very still. "Okay," Ron said. He sounded like someone who had put a very heavy thing down and was now assessing where to go without it. "What happens next?" "The examination team comes tomorrow," Hermione said. "You won't need to do anything except confirm he's been in your family since 1981. "And then?" "Then Peter Pettigrew gets to answer for what he did," Harry said. He kept his voice even. He looked at the rat in his palm, and the rat looked back. "And Sirius Black comes home." The examination team arrived the following afternoon. They were quiet and professional and Amelia Bones came personally, which Harry noted as significant. The Animagus revelation charm took 4 minutes and produced, in the place of a grey rat on the floor of an empty classroom, a small, sweating, desperate-eyed man who looked around at the assembled faces and attempted, immediately, to run. He made it approximately 4 steps. Harry said, very quietly, "Incarcerus." He'd never used the spell before in a practical context but the magic went exactly where he sent it, the ropes appearing with the specific precision that had characterized his magic since it arrived fully at 8, and Pettigrew hit the floor in a way that was undignified and absolute. Amelia Bones looked at Harry. "He would have bitten through a restraint charm within 30 seconds, Harry said. "He's been an Animagus for 30 years. He knows the limits of soft magic." Bones looked at Pettigrew on the floor. Then she said to her team, "Secure him," and to Harry, "That was a ministry-grade casting." "I've been practicing for 3 years," Harry said. Pettigrew, from the floor, said nothing. He was crying, which Harry observed and filed under information that was relevant but did not require any particular response from him. The letter to Sirius that evening was the shortest he had ever written. "It's done. Pettigrew is in ministry custody. Bones has the wand, early tests are already showing clean. Come home." He sent it with Hedwig and watched her go from the astronomy tower window, the cold November air moving through the open shutter, the grounds of Hogwarts dark and quiet below. He thought about Sirius Black in a house that smelled of old parchment and 12 years of absence, reading this letter by whatever light the house elves had managed to keep going. He thought about the photograph in his trunk, the 2 laughing people, the boy and the girl waving at a camera a long time ago, not knowing what was coming but alive and bright and completely, entirely themselves. He thought about Narcissa opening a cupboard door in the rain. He thought about all of it, the 5 years and the 5 hours today and the whole enormous shape of what had changed and what was still left to change, and he stood at the astronomy tower window and breathed the cold air, and he was not afraid, and he was not finished, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Below him the castle moved in its ancient rhythms. In the Gryffindor common room Hermione was already working on something new. In the Slytherin dungeons Draco was, presumably, having the particular kind of evening that came after you'd successfully completed a mission and needed to let the tension out somewhere. In the Ministry of Magic, Amelia Bones was looking at the results of a wand test that would, by morning, be the end of one narrative and the beginning of several others. In London, at Grimmauld Place, a letter was arriving. Harry turned from the window and went back inside. He had 7 years of Hogwarts ahead of him. He had a Wisengamot seat that would become fully active at 17. He had the full black family magic running through him at all 16 symbols and a mind that had been trained by the most precise woman he'd ever known and a collection of allies who had chosen him rather than been assigned to him, which was the kind of alliance that held. He had a rat in ministry custody who was going to answer every question Amelia Bones put to him, because Peter Pettigrew had not survived 30 years by being brave and would not start now. He had a lot to do. He went to find Hermione, because she was almost certainly already planning the next thing and he wanted to know what it was. She was at the desk by the fire, as he'd expected, with 3 books open and a page of notes that was already filling up, and she looked up when he came in and said, without preamble, "The Wisengamot investigation is going to produce documentation that implicates Crouch. When it does, Fudge is going to try to contain it. We should have a response ready." "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "I've started a brief." She slid the notes toward him. "Tell me what I'm missing." He pulled up the chair across from her, picked up the notes, and began to read. Ron came in from the dormitory 10 minutes later, looked at the two of them across the table, and sat down beside Hermione without being asked. He pulled a blank page toward himself and said, "What are we doing?" "Getting ahead of something," Harry said, without looking up. "Right," Ron said, and picked up a quill. Outside, the castle was doing its ordinary old work. The stars were doing theirs. And in a house in London that smelled of old parchment and 12 years of waiting, a door opened for the first time in a long time, and let in the night air, which was cold and clean and full of the particular quality that belonged to beginnings rather than endings. Harry kept reading.